Hello everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth, here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Let's get started. It all started with a phone call, a call that was never meant to reach her. It was a cold, rainy December night and Ava lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The gentle patter of rain against the window should have been soothing, but an unsettling feeling kept her awake. The shadows in her room felt too long, the silence too heavy. When her phone buzzed on the nightstand, it startled her. She grabbed it, squinting at the screen. The caller ID was blank, just a flickering line of static. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen. At 2:37 a.m., no call was ever good news. Against her better judgment, she swiped to answer. "Hello," she whispered, her voice hoarse. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of static. She frowned and was about to hang up when a voice cut through the noise, soft and unnervingly calm. "You're not supposed to answer this," it said. Ava froze. "Who is this?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The voice didn't reply. Instead, the line went dead, leaving her sitting in the dark, the phone still pressed to her ear. The rain outside seemed louder now, as if the world was holding its breath. She set the phone down and tried to shake off the unease. It was probably a prank, she told herself. Maybe some drunk kid dialing random numbers. She lay back down, pulling the blanket up to her chin. But as her breathing slowed, another sound interrupted the quiet, a notification buzz. Her stomach tightened as she reached for her phone again. The screen glowed in the darkness, displaying a message. There was no name, no number, just 5 words. "You should have stayed asleep." A chill ran down her spine. Her hand trembled as she reread the message. She tapped on it, hoping to find some clue, but there was nothing. No sender, no thread, nothing to suggest where it had come from. For a moment, she considered calling someone, her best friend, Emma, or even the police, but what would she say? That she got a weird text? She set the phone down and tried to convince herself it was nothing. Yet the heaviness in the air remained, pressing down on her like a weight. The hours crawled by, and eventually exhaustion took over. Ava drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't restful. Her dreams were vivid and strange. She was running through a forest, branches clawing at her skin, the ground slick with mud. Something was chasing her, a shadow with no form, no face, but its presence was suffocating. She woke with a start, her heart pounding. Morning light seeped through the curtains, but it did little to ease her fear. Her phone buzzed again and she snatched it up, dreading what she might see. This time the message was longer. "You answered the call. Now it begins asterisk asterisk." Before she could process the words, her phone started ringing. The same blank ID. Her thumb hovered over the screen, paralyzed by indecision. She didn't want to answer, but a part of her felt like she had no choice. When she finally swiped to accept the call, the voice on the other end was different. It was rough, panicked, and frantic. "Listen to me," the man said. "You need to leave your house. No, they're coming." "What? Who's coming?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You don't have time," he shouted. "They're already—" The call cut off. Ava jumped out of bed, her heart racing. She ran to the window and pulled back the curtain. The street outside was empty, drenched in rain, but something felt wrong. The world was too still. A loud knock on the front door made her jump. It wasn't a polite knock, it was forceful, insistent. She crept down the hallway, every step feeling heavier than the last. "Who is it?" she called out, trying to mask the fear in her voice. There was no answer, just another knock, harder this time. Ava peeked through the peephole, but there was no one there. The knocking stopped, replaced by a faint scratching sound. It came from the back door now, and then the windows. It was as if something was circling the house, testing every entry point. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't resist. Another message. "Don't let them in. No matter what you hear, no matter what they say, don't open the door asterisk asterisk." The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Ava backed away, her mind racing. She didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer safe in her own home. She grabbed her car keys and her jacket, determined to leave, but as she reached for the door, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from her phone screen. And then she heard it, a voice, faint and pleading. "Ava, please, it's me. Open the door." It was Emma's voice. Ava froze. Emma's voice was unmistakable, but how could she be here? They hadn't spoken in days, and Emma didn't even know where Ava lived now. Her hand hovered over the door handle as doubt clawed at her mind. "Ava," the voice called again, trembling, desperate. "Please, it's so cold. Let me in." Something wasn't right. Emma would have called first. She wouldn't just show up unannounced, especially not in the middle of the night. Ava pressed her forehead against the door, trying to think. "Emma? Is that really you?" There was a long pause. Too long. "Of course it's me," the voice said finally, but something about the tone was off. It was almost as if someone was trying too hard to sound like Emma. Ava backed away from the door, her chest tightening. Her phone buzzed in her hand, startling her. Another message flashed across the screen. "It's not her. Don't open the door ****. Her breath hitched. The warning sent a fresh wave of panic through her. If that wasn't Emma, then who, or what, was outside? The knocking started again, harder this time, rattling the door in its frame. "Ava, please. Why won't you open the door?" "It's me." Her instincts screamed at her to run, but where could she go? The windows, the back door, they all felt like traps now. Her house, once a sanctuary, had become a cage. Then came another noise different from the knocking. A low, guttural growl. It came from the other side of the door, and it wasn't human. Ava clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. The growling stopped, replaced by silence. For a moment she thought it might be over. Maybe whatever it was had given up. But then came a sound that chilled her to the bone, the creak of floorboards inside the house. Her mind raced. Oh. Every door was locked, every window shut. She spun around, her eyes darting to the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. "Ava," the voice called again, but this time it was inside. Her knees nearly buckled. She backed up until her spine hit the wall, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in around her. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow and deliberate. They were coming closer. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't dare look away from the darkened hallway. The footsteps stopped just out of sight around the corner. "Ava," the voice whispered, softer now, almost gentle. "Why are you hiding from me?" She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. The phone buzzed again, more urgently this time. With trembling hands, she glanced down at the screen. "Get out now. Don't look at it ****. Her stomach churned. "Don't look at what?" The footsteps started again, faster now, almost running. Ava bolted for the kitchen, her bare feet slipping on the hardwood floor. She grabbed the biggest knife she could find, clutching it so tightly her knuckles turned white. The house was eerily quiet again. No footsteps, no voice. Just the sound of her own ragged breathing. And then she saw it. A shadow moved across the far wall, its shape distorted, unnatural. It wasn't Emma. It wasn't anyone. The thing was taller than any human should be, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and wrong. Ava's throat tightened as she watched the shadow stretch across the room, creeping closer. She clutched the knife, her mind screaming at her to do something, anything. But she was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The shadow stopped. It seemed to sense her, turning its head, or what should have been its head, toward her. And then it spoke, its voice a twisted, mocking imitation of Emma's. "Ava," it said, dragging out her name like a taunt. "Let's play a game." She couldn't take it anymore. With a surge of adrenaline, she bolted for the front door. She fumbled with the locks, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Behind her, she heard the thing move, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. Just as she threw the door open, something cold and sharp grazed the back of her neck. She didn't look back. She ran out into the pouring rain, her feet splashing through puddles as she sprinted down the street. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, every house dark, every street lamp flickering. She didn't stop running until she reached the main road. Her chest burned, her legs ached, but she couldn't stop. Her phone buzzed again. She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she unlocked the screen. You can't run from it. Her heart sank. She looked around, her breath fogging in the cold air. The rain was falling harder now, soaking her to the bone. She was alone, or at least she thought she was. A car's headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness. She waved her arms, desperate for help. The car slowed, pulling over to the side of the road. The driver rolled down the window, a middle-aged man with kind eyes. "Are you okay, miss?" he asked. I don't know, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Get in, he said. I'll take you somewhere safe. Ava hesitated. She didn't trust anyone anymore, but what choice did she have? The shadow was still out there, and she couldn't face it alone. She climbed into the car, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The man smiled at her, but there was something in his eyes that made her stomach twist. As the car pulled away, her phone buzzed one last time. She looked down at the screen, her blood running cold. You just made a terrible mistake. The car's interior smelled faintly of leather and cigarette smoke. Rain drummed against the windows as the driver pulled onto the empty road. Ava sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her wet clothes clinging to her skin, her breath shallow and uneven. She gripped her phone tightly, the last message still glaring back at her. You just made a terrible mistake. Her instincts screamed at her to get out of the car, but where could she go? The man beside her seemed calm, almost too calm. His hands rested on the steering wheel, his knuckles slightly pale under the flickering streetlights. Rough night? He asked, his voice casual, as if they were two strangers making small talk. Ava nodded slowly, her throat too dry to answer. She glanced at his face, trying to gauge his intentions. He looked normal enough, short, graying hair, a lined face that suggested years of hard work. But something about him felt off. His smile lingered too long, and his eyes didn't quite match the friendly tone in his voice. Where are you headed? He asked, breaking the silence. Anywhere but here, Ava muttered, her voice barely audible. He chuckled, but the sound sent a chill down her spine. That's a dangerous thing to say, you know. This late at night, you never know who might be listening. Her grip tightened on her phone. She forced a weak smile, hoping to mask her growing unease. The car rolled to a stop at a red light. Outside, the rain blurred the world into streaks of gray and black. Ava's reflection stared back at her in the window, pale and wide-eyed. She turned her attention to the dashboard, noticing something strange. The clock wasn't moving. The numbers were stuck at 3:15 a.m., flickering faintly as if the power was failing. Your clock's broken, she said, her voice trembling. The man glanced at the dashboard, his smile widening. Is it? Ava's chest tightened. She looked down at her phone to check the time, but the screen was blank. No messages, no signal, no time. Just a faint glow that seemed to mock her. Relax, the man said, his tone almost soothing. We're almost there. Almost where? She asked, her voice sharper than she intended. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned onto a narrow, unlit road that wound through dense trees. The headlights barely penetrated the darkness, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Ava's heart pounded. She glanced at the door handle, considering her options. Could she jump out? Run. But the car was moving too fast, and the woods outside looked endless. The man reached for the radio, twisting the dial. Static filled the car, broken by faint whispers that made Ava's skin crawl. Do you hear that? He asked, his voice low and almost reverent. She shook her head, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. I just want to get out of here, she said, her voice cracking. All in good time, he replied, his smile fading. The static grew louder, the whispers more distinct. Ava strained to make out the words, but they were too fragmented, too chaotic. It sounded like dozens of voices speaking at once, overlapping in a way that made her ears ache. And then she heard it, her name. Ava. Her blood ran cold. She whipped her head toward the man, but he was staring straight ahead, his face expressionless. Did you hear that? She demanded. He didn't respond. The car slowed as they approached a clearing. A small house stood in the center, its windows dark, its silhouette crooked and menacing. The sight of it filled Ava with dread. Here we are, the man said, pulling into the driveway. I'm not getting out, Ava said firmly, her voice shaking. The man turned to her, his smile returning. You don't have a choice. Before she could react, the car doors locked with a loud click. Ava's chest tightened as she frantically pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Let me out, she screamed, slamming her fists against the window. The man leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. It's better if you come inside, he said, his voice calm but chilling. They're waiting for you. Who's waiting? Ava demanded, her voice breaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he opened his door and stepped out, leaving her alone in the locked car. Rain poured down, blurring his figure as he walked toward the house. Her phone buzzed again. She fumbled to unlock it, her hands shaking violently. A new message appeared. Do not go inside. Ava's breath caught in her throat. She looked up at the house, its dark windows like empty eyes staring back at her. The man was standing at the front door now, motioning for her to follow. Her phone buzzed again, the screen flashing urgently. If you go inside, you'll never come out. Ava's mind raced. She had to get out of the car, but how? She glanced around, her eyes landing on the keys still in the ignition. She twisted them, praying the car would start, but the engine only sputtered. Outside, the man's figure grew darker, less human. His limbs stretched unnaturally, his head tilting at an impossible angle. He began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that made her stomach churn. Ava's panic reached a breaking point. She kicked at the door, the glass, anything to break free. The rain outside grew heavier, the world around her dissolving into chaos. And then, without warning, the car unlocked. Ava didn't hesitate. She threw the door open and ran, her feet slipping on the wet ground. She didn't know where she was going, she just needed to get away. The man's laughter followed her, growing louder and more distorted. She risked a glance over her shoulder and instantly regretted it. He was no longer a man. His body twisted and writhed, his face splitting into a grotesque grin that stretched far beyond human limits. Ava screamed, her voice swallowed by the storm. She ran into the woods, the branches clawing at her skin, the darkness pressing in around her. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she couldn't stop. Her phone buzzed again, the light barely illuminating the path ahead. Keep running. Don't stop, asterisk asterisk. Ava's breaths came in sharp, uneven gasps as she tore through the forest. The rain drenched her completely, each drop feeling like a needle against her skin. The trees loomed taller, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, snagging her hair and clothes. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified by her fear. Her mind raced with fragments of questions. What was that thing? Why had it called her by name? And most haunting of all, how did her phone know what was happening? She glanced at the screen again, desperate for any clue. The last message still glowed faintly. Keep running. Don't stop, asterisk asterisk. But for how long? Where could she go when there seemed to be no end to the suffocating forest around her? Ava's foot snagged on a root, sending her sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through her ankle as she landed hard, her palms scraping against the rough, wet earth. She bit back a scream, clenching her teeth as she tried to push herself up. And then she heard it, a low, guttural growl, deeper and closer than before. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Slowly, she turned her head toward the sound. Through the sheets of rain, she saw it, an outline impossibly tall and grotesquely thin. Its limbs moved unnaturally, each motion jerky yet deliberate, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. The thing stepped closer, its elongated fingers scraping against the bark of a nearby tree. The sound sent chills down her spine. Ava, it crooned, its voice warped like 100 different tones speaking at once. You can't hide. Tears blurred her vision as she scrambled to her feet, ignoring the sharp pain in her ankle. She ran blindly, each step a battle against the slick mud and her own exhaustion. The forest seemed endless, an unforgiving labyrinth of darkness and rain. The growls grew louder, more guttural, as if the thing was toying with her, letting her think she had a chance to escape. Her phone buzzed again, startling her. She risked a glance at the screen. Well, now an asterisk asterisk. She didn't think, she just obeyed, veering sharply to the left. Almost immediately, the ground beneath her gave way, and she tumbled down a steep embankment. The world spun around her as she rolled, branches and rocks tearing at her skin. When she finally came to a stop, she was lying in a shallow stream. The icy water seeped into her clothes, shocking her system. For a moment, she just lay there, staring up at the rain-soaked canopy above, trying to catch her breath. But the silence didn't last. A faint, wet, slithering sound reached her ears, growing louder with each passing second. Ava forced herself to sit up, wincing as pain radiated through her body. She looked around, her heart sinking as she realized she was at the bottom of a ravine. The steep walls on either side seemed impossible to climb, especially in the rain. Her phone buzzed again. She snatched it up, desperate for guidance. It's in the water. Get out. Now an asterisk asterisk. Ava's blood turned to ice. Slowly, she looked down at the stream. At first, it seemed normal, the water rushing past her feet. But then she saw it, ripples moving against the current, heading straight toward her. Panic surged through her veins as she scrambled to her feet. The mud made it difficult to gain traction, and she slipped twice before managing to climb onto the rocky bank. She turned just in time to see something break the surface of the water. It wasn't the thing from the car. This was different, smaller but no less terrifying. Its skin was slick and pale, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It moved with unnerving speed, its limbs contorting in impossible ways as it crawled onto the bank where Ava had just been. She backed away, her foot slipping on a loose rock. The creature's head snapped toward her, its mouth opening to reveal rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. It let out a shriek that made her ears ring. Ava turned and ran, her body screaming in protest. She didn't care about the pain, didn't care about the exhaustion. Survival was the only thing that mattered now. The creature gave chase, its shrieks echoing through the ravine. It was faster than she was, gaining on her with every step. Ava's lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, her vision blurring from the rain and tears. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't dare look. Not until she found somewhere, anywhere, to hide. Ahead, she spotted a cluster of boulders jutting out of the ravine wall. They formed a small alcove just big enough for her to squeeze into. She didn't think, she dove for it, wedging herself into the narrow space. Her phone buzzed again. Hands trembling, she glanced at the screen. Stay still. Don't breathe asterisk asterisk. She clamped a hand over her mouth, her chest heaving as she struggled to control her breathing. Outside, the creature slowed, its shrieks turning into low, guttural clicks. Ava pressed herself deeper into the alcove, her body trembling. The creature's shadow loomed just outside, its distorted form barely visible through the rain. It sniffed the air, its head twitching unnaturally. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, its glowing eyes scanning the ravine. Ava's heart pounded so loudly she was sure it could hear her. The creature let out another shriek, then scuttled away, its movements quick and erratic. Ava didn't move. She stayed in the alcove, her hands still over her mouth, until the sounds of the creature faded completely. Only then did she allow herself to exhale, her body sagging with relief. Her phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up in the darkness. It's not over. Keep moving asterisk asterisk. She groaned softly, every muscle in her body protesting as she pulled herself out of the alcove. Her clothes were torn, her skin scraped and bruised. But she was alive. For now. The rain began to let up as she made her way further down the ravine, her steps cautious and deliberate. The forest around her was eerily silent, the only sound the faint trickle of water from the stream. Her phone buzzed again, but this time the message was different. Turn around. Her blood ran cold. Slowly she turned, her eyes widening as she saw the figure standing at the top of the ravine. It was him, the man from the car. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, dozens of shadowy figures emerged from the trees, their shapes shifting and blending into the darkness. Their glowing eyes locked onto her, unblinking. Ava, the man called, his voice echoing unnaturally through the ravine. It's time to come home. Her scream echoed into the night as the shadows began to descend. Ava's scream dissolved into the chaos of her pounding heart and the relentless rain. She stumbled backward, her foot slipping on the wet rocks of the ravine. The man, no, the thing, stood at the edge, staring down at her with that impossible smile. Behind him, the shadowy figures moved unnaturally, their eyes glowing like embers in the gloom. Her thoughts raced. There was nowhere to go. The ravine walls were too steep to climb, and the stream behind her seemed to churn unnaturally, as if something was waiting just beneath the surface. Ava, the man said again, his voice carrying through the ravine like a whisper that settled deep into her bones. You've been running long enough? No, she yelled, her voice hoarse. Stay away from me. The figures behind him began to descend, their movements fluid yet distorted, like reflections in a shattered mirror. Ava turned and ran, her feet slipping on the slick ground. The ravine narrowed ahead, forcing her into the stream. The icy water bit into her legs as she splashed through it, every step an effort. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear them, the heavy, deliberate footsteps of the man and the lighter, scuttling sounds of the others. Her phone buzzed again. She fumbled to pull it from her pocket, nearly dropping it into the water. The screen lit up with another message. Keep going. Don't stop. You're close asterisk asterisk. Close to what? Ava wanted to scream, but she couldn't waste the breath. She pushed forward, her body aching with every movement. The ravine walls began to rise higher, the trees above blocking out what little light the night had offered. And then she saw it, a faint glow ahead, pulsing softly like a distant beacon. Her chest tightened with both hope and dread. Was it safety or just another trap? The answer didn't matter. She had no choice but to move toward it. The glow grew brighter as she approached, revealing a break in the ravine wall. A narrow path led upward, winding through the trees. Ava didn't hesitate. She scrambled onto the path, her hands clawing at the damp earth for support. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. The figures were faster now, their distorted voices echoing through the ravine. Ava, they called, their tones overlapping in a chilling cacophony. Don't you want to come home? She didn't look back. She couldn't. The path twisted sharply, leading to a small clearing bathed in an eerie, silvery light. In the center stood a massive tree, its gnarled roots sprawling like veins across the ground. Ava froze. The tree was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its bark shimmered faintly, and its branches stretched impossibly high, disappearing into the darkness above. At its base, there was a hollow wide enough for a person to step through. Her phone buzzed again. Inside. No. It's your only chance, ***. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stay away. But the sounds of the figures closing in left her no choice. Gritting her teeth, she stumbled toward the tree, the light growing almost blinding as she neared. The hollow was warm, almost inviting, in stark contrast to the cold, damp forest. Ava hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The world shifted around her. The air grew still, the rain silenced. Ava found herself standing in a vast, open field under a sky filled with unfamiliar constellations. The grass beneath her feet was soft and warm, swaying gently despite the lack of wind. For a moment, she felt a strange sense of peace. The horrors of the forest seemed distant, almost unreal. But the feeling didn't last. The tree loomed behind her, its hollow now glowing faintly. From within, she could hear the distorted voices of the figures, growing louder. Ava backed away, her pulse quickening. "Where am I?" she whispered. Her phone buzzed again. "You're safe for now. But you have to keep moving ***. She looked around, searching for any sign of where to go. In the distance, she spotted a faint outline of a structure, barely visible against the horizon. It looked like a house, though its jagged silhouette filled her with unease. Her phone buzzed once more. "Go to the house. It's the only way out ***. Ava clenched her fists, her body trembling. She didn't trust the messages, but what choice did she have? The alternative was staying here, trapped in a strange alien field with no direction and no answers. She began walking, her legs feeling like lead. The grass seemed to resist her movements, tangling around her ankles. The house grew closer, its details becoming clearer. The windows were dark, and the roof sagged as if the entire structure was on the verge of collapse. Ava's stomach churned as she approached. Something about the house felt wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. But her phone buzzed again, pushing her forward. "Don't stop now. You're almost there ***. She reached the front door, her hand trembling as she grasped the rusted handle. The wood felt unnaturally cold under her touch. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of decay. The walls were lined with photographs, each one slightly blurred, as if the faces within them were in motion. Ava stepped inside, her shoes creaking on the warped floorboards. The door slammed shut behind her, making her jump. Her phone buzzed again. "Upstairs. Quickly ***. She looked toward the staircase, its steps spiraling into darkness. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn back, but the whispers outside the house were growing louder. The figures were here. Ava stood frozen at the base of the staircase, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the creaking floorboards beneath her. The air inside the house was stifling, carrying an unsettling mix of damp wood and decay. She could hear faint whispers outside, growing louder, pressing against the walls of the house like an encroaching tide. Her phone buzzed again, startling her. The message on the screen was stark and unforgiving. "Upstairs. No. Don't hesitate ***. She stared up the staircase. The steps were old and uneven, their edges splintered. The darkness at the top seemed impenetrable, as if it led to another world entirely. But the whispers outside were closer now, almost at the door. Ava could hear them overlapping, like a chorus of voices speaking her name in distorted unison. There was no time to think. Clenching her fist, she forced herself to ascend, each step creaking ominously beneath her weight. The sound echoed through the empty house, making her wince. She kept her eyes locked on the top of the stairs, refusing to look back. Halfway up, she heard the front door rattle. A guttural growl pierced the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of nails, no claws, scraping against the wood. She froze, her hand gripping the banister so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her phone buzzed again. "Don't stop. They'll find you if you hesitate ****. She swallowed hard and continued climbing, her legs trembling with every step. The door downstairs groaned under the weight of something pressing against it. Ava's breaths came in shallow gasps as she reached the top of the staircase. The hallway before her stretched endlessly, its walls lined with doors. Each one was slightly ajar, revealing only slivers of darkness beyond. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoed from somewhere down the hall, but she couldn't tell which door it was coming from. Her phone buzzed once more. "Third door on the left. Go inside. Noun ****. Ava's stomach twisted. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to leave this place and face whatever was outside instead. But the thought of those glowing eyes and distorted voices made her legs move forward, one hesitant step at a time. She reached the third door, her hand trembling as she pushed it open. The room beyond was small and empty, the walls bare and cracked. A single window at the far end let in a faint, cold light. In the center of the room stood a chair, its back facing her. Her phone buzzed again. "Sit. Don't look behind you ****. She hesitated, her pulse racing. The message made her blood run cold. "Don't look behind you." What was behind her? She stepped into the room, her movements slow and deliberate. The whispers from the hallway faded the moment she crossed the threshold, replaced by an eerie silence. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of danger, but there was nothing. Just the chair. Her phone buzzed again, the message more urgent this time. "Sit. Noun ****. Ava approached the chair, her breath shallow. She turned and lowered herself onto the seat, her body rigid with tension. The wood creaked under her weight, the sound impossibly loud in the oppressive silence. And then she felt it. A presence. It was faint at first, like a shift in the air behind her. But it grew stronger, pressing against her back like an invisible weight. Her heart raced as she clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "Don't look behind you." The words repeated in her mind over and over like a mantra. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the overwhelming urge to turn around. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't dare look at it this time. Whatever was behind her was so close now, she could feel its cold breath on the back of her neck. And then it spoke. "Ava?" The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it sent a wave of terror coursing through her body. She bit her lip to keep from screaming, her entire body trembling. "You've come so far," the voice continued, "but you can't run forever." She couldn't respond, couldn't move. Her breaths came in shallow, uneven gasps as tears streamed down her face. The presence behind her shifted, the air growing colder. She felt the faintest brush of fingers against her shoulder, and her body tensed. Her phone buzzed again, the sound cutting through the suffocating silence. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Ava glanced down at the screen. "Stand up. Walk to the window. Don't look back ****. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edges of the chair. Slowly she rose to her feet, her knees threatening to give out beneath her. The cold breath on her neck grew stronger, and she could feel the presence moving closer. She kept her eyes fixed on the window, forcing herself to take one step, then another. The room seemed to stretch endlessly, the window retreating further away with each step she took. The voice behind her grew louder, more insistent. "Ava, don't leave. Stay with me." Her pulse thundered in her ears as she reached the window. She placed her hands on the cold glass, her reflection staring back at her with wide, terrified eyes. Her phone buzzed again. "Jump. No. It's the only way out ****. Her heart sank. Jump? The thought was insane. But the whispers behind her grew louder, the presence closing in until she could feel it pressing against her back. "You can't escape," the voice hissed. "You belong here now." With a scream of desperation, Ava pushed the window open. The cold night air rushed in, stinging her face. Below, she could see the forest stretching endlessly into the darkness. She hesitated for only a moment before throwing herself through the opening. The wind roared in her ears as she fell, the ground rushing up to meet her. She braced for impact, her heart pounding, but she didn't hit the ground. Instead, she found herself standing, unharmed, in the middle of a field. The house was gone, the forest a distant memory. Above her, the stars shone brightly in a clear sky. Her phone buzzed one last time. You're safe for now. But the real test begins soon. Ava dropped the phone, her hands trembling. She looked around, her breath hitching as she realized she wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured but their eyes glowing faintly. They formed a circle around her, their presence suffocating. And then, from the darkness, a familiar voice spoke. "Welcome home, Ava." Ava's knees buckled, but she managed to remain standing, her eyes darting between the glowing figures surrounding her. Their movements were subtle, small shifts of weight, the faint tilting of heads, but their presence was oppressive, suffocating. The air seemed to thicken around her, and every breath felt like she was inhaling smoke. "Welcome home, Ava," the voice repeated, chillingly calm, yet so familiar it sent a wave of nausea through her. "Who are you?" Ava's voice cracked, but she forced the words out. "What do you want from me?" One of the figures stepped forward. Its form was barely distinguishable, cloaked in shadows that seemed to ripple like water. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, and Ava's stomach churned as she felt the weight of its gaze. "You've always known who we are," it said, its voice a distorted echo of her own. Ava stumbled back, shaking her head. No, I don't know you. I don't know any of this." The figure tilted its head, almost curiously. "Don't you?" Her phone buzzed, the sound jarring in the tense silence. Ava's trembling hand reached for it, but she hesitated. She didn't want to see the words. She didn't want another command, another cryptic message forcing her deeper into this nightmare. But the figures were closing in, their steps slow and deliberate. Her fingers closed around the phone, and she lifted it, her breath catching as the message appeared. "Run to the edge of the circle. Don't stop, no matter what, ***. Her heart sank. The edge of the circle was guarded by the figures, their eyes glowing brighter with each passing second. Their forms seemed to solidify as they moved closer, their shadowy outlines giving way to grotesque, twisted shapes. Ava had no choice. She took a deep breath, her body trembling, and bolted toward the nearest gap between the figures. As soon as she moved, they reacted. The glow in their eyes intensified, and their bodies contorted, stretching unnaturally as they lunged toward her. Ava screamed, ducking beneath an outstretched arm that seemed to dissolve into black smoke as it grazed her. The edge of the circle was closer now, but the figures were faster than they looked. Their distorted voices filled the air, calling her name, pleading, mocking, threatening. "Ava, come back. You can't run forever. This is where you belong." She reached the edge, her lungs burning and her legs threatening to give out. Without thinking, she dove forward, crossing the boundary marked by their presence. The moment she broke free, the world around her shifted violently. The field dissolved into darkness, and Ava felt herself falling. The sensation was disorienting, as if gravity itself had abandoned her. Her screams echoed into the void, swallowed by the emptiness. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the falling stopped. Ava hit the ground hard, the impact jarring her entire body. She groaned, her head spinning as she tried to push herself up. The surface beneath her was cold and smooth, like polished stone. As her vision cleared, she realized she was no longer in the field, or anywhere remotely familiar. The space around her was vast and dimly lit, the walls adorned with strange, glowing symbols that pulsed faintly. The air was heavy, humming with an energy that made her skin crawl. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface etched with the same glowing symbols. Resting on top of it was an object, a small, intricately carved box. Ava's phone buzzed again and she flinched. She didn't want to look, but her curiosity got the better of her. "Open the box." She stared at the message, her heart pounding. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm not doing this anymore." The symbols on the walls began to pulse faster, the light intensifying. The hum in the air grew louder, resonating in her chest. Ava clutched her head, her thoughts a chaotic mess. Her phone buzzed again, the screen flashing with a single word. "No. Tears streamed down her face as she stumbled toward the pedestal. Her hands trembled as she reached for the box, her fingers brushing against its smooth surface. The moment she touched it, the room erupted in light. Ava screamed as the symbols on the walls blazed brightly, their patterns shifting and twisting. The box began to vibrate in her hands, and she felt an overwhelming surge of energy coursing through her body. Voices filled the room, hundreds, maybe thousands, all speaking at once. They were incoherent at first, but gradually they began to form words, sentences, commands. Open it. Set us free. You have no choice. Ava's grip tightened on the box. Why me? She cried, her voice breaking. What do you want from me? The voices didn't answer. They only grew louder, more insistent. With a scream of defiance, Ava wrenched the lid of the box open. The light exploded outward, blinding her. The voices reached a deafening crescendo before abruptly cutting off, leaving the room in silence once more. When the light faded, Ava found herself standing in a forest. But it wasn't the same forest she had fled from before. This one was eerily still, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air was thick with an unnatural fog that clung to her skin. Her phone buzzed again. Ava didn't want to look, but she couldn't resist. The message was different this time, the words chilling in their simplicity. You've opened the door. Now you must close it, asterisk asterisk. Ava's breath hitched as she stared at the screen. Before she could process the message, a sound cut through the silence. A low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere deep within the fog. She turned slowly, her body tense. Shapes began to emerge from the mist, their movements deliberate and predatory. Ava's phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't look. She didn't need to. She already knew what it would say. Ava's legs refused to move as the growls deepened, reverberating through the dense, suffocating fog. Shapes shifted in the mist, their movements slow but deliberate, like predators circling their prey. Her breathing quickened, each exhale forming small clouds in the icy air. The forest was unnaturally silent except for those growls. No chirping crickets. No rustling leaves. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath for what was to come. Ava's phone vibrated in her hand, the sound unnervingly loud against the eerie quiet. She hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribcage. She didn't want to look, but her trembling fingers moved on their own. Don't stand still. It sees you when you stop. Or, noun asterisk asterisk. Her blood ran cold. The implication of the message made her stomach churn. Her gaze flicked back to the mist, where those shadowy forms continued to move closer, their outlines becoming clearer with each passing second. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as sandpaper, and forced her feet to take a step forward. The moment she moved, the growls softened. Her steps were slow and measured, the ground beneath her crackling faintly with brittle twigs and dead leaves. Every noise she made felt amplified, as if it echoed across an endless chasm. The mist seemed to shift around her, closing in with every step, but she didn't dare stop. Her phone vibrated again. Ava clenched it tightly, her fingers trembling as she read the next message. Do not turn around. No matter what you hear, asterisk asterisk. Ava's stomach tightened. The weight of the command felt unbearable, especially as she started hearing faint whispers behind her, distorted, garbled, but unmistakably human. They were calling her name. Ava? The voices were layered, overlapping. Some sounded familiar, like people she'd known once but couldn't place. Others were harsher, guttural, as though spoken by something that had never been human at all. Keep walking, she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. Just keep walking. The fog thickened around her, making it harder to see where she was going. The gnarled trees seemed to lean closer, their twisted branches clawing at the air. She stumbled over an exposed root, catching herself just before she fell. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Ava, stop. Please. Turn around. We need you. You can't leave us. Her lips quivered, tears streaming down her face. The voices sounded so real, so desperate. But she knew, deep down in the pit of her soul, that they weren't. The growling returned, low and menacing, but this time it was closer. Too close. Ava's breath hitched as she felt the ground vibrate beneath her feet, each step of the unseen creature sending shockwaves through her body. Her phone buzzed again. The message was short, brutal. Run. Noun asterisk asterisk. She didn't hesitate. Ava broke into a sprint, her legs burning as she pushed herself forward. The whispers turned into screams, the growls into deafening roars. The mist swirled violently around her as if alive, trying to pull her back. Her foot caught on something and she fell hard, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. She gasped, scrambling to her feet as the ground shook with the approach of the creature. She dared a glance over her shoulder and immediately regretted it. The thing chasing her was massive, its form shifting and writhing like a living shadow. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth was a gaping void filled with rows of jagged teeth. Tendrils of darkness extended from its body, reaching for her, hungry and relentless. Ava screamed, forcing herself to run faster. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins kept her moving. Ahead, she saw a faint light cutting through the fog. It was small, flickering, but it was enough to give her hope. She focused on it, using it as a lifeline, her only chance of escape. The growls grew louder, the creature closing the distance with terrifying speed. She could feel its presence bearing down on her, its breath cold and rancid against her skin. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't dare look at it this time. She didn't need another command, she just needed to reach that light. The ground beneath her shifted, the once solid earth turning soft and unstable. Her feet sank with every step, slowing her down. She screamed in frustration, her fingers clawing at the air as she fought to keep moving. The light was closer now, but so was the creature. Ava felt a tendril wrap around her ankle, its touch icy and suffocating. She cried out, kicking wildly, but its grip tightened, pulling her down. She clawed at the ground, her nails scraping against the dirt as she fought to free herself. "Let me go," she screamed, her voice raw and desperate. The tendril pulled harder, dragging her toward the creature. She could feel its breath on the back of her neck, its growls reverberating through her bones. In a final act of desperation, Ava grabbed her phone, holding it up like a weapon. The screen glowed brightly, casting a faint light on the tendril. The creature recoiled with a screech, its grip loosening just enough for her to break free. She scrambled to her feet, the light ahead now blinding. She threw herself toward it, every ounce of strength focused on escaping. As she crossed into the light, the growls and screams behind her vanished. Ava collapsed to the ground, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. The world around her was quiet, the oppressive fog replaced by an open field bathed in moonlight. Her phone buzzed once more. She hesitated, her hands trembling, before looking at the screen. "You escaped for now. But the door remains open. Close it or it will find you again ****. Ava's hands shook as she clutched the phone, her mind racing. She looked around the field, searching for any sign of what she was supposed to do next. And then she saw it. A doorway standing in the middle of the field, glowing faintly, its surface etched with the same symbols she'd seen in the room before. Her stomach twisted. The thought of going near that doorway filled her with dread. But she knew she had no choice. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and she heard the faint growls returning in the distance. Time was running out. Ava's heart pounded as she stared at the doorway, its glow calling to her like a beacon. But the dread pooling in her stomach made every step toward it feel like an eternity. She could hear the growls in the distance again, getting closer. The creature was still out there, hunting her, and it wouldn't stop until she closed the door she had opened. She didn't know what would happen when she crossed that threshold, but she understood, instinctively, that this was her last chance to escape. The fog had followed her here, the growls still reverberating through the ground beneath her feet. And the symbols etched on the doorway, they were burning into her memory, a constant reminder of the nightmare she was caught in. Ava's legs trembled with fear as she took her first step toward the glowing doorway. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts, her hands slick with sweat as they gripped her phone. The words on the screen lingered in her mind like a warning. "Close it or it will find you again." The pressure of the growls behind her was unbearable. Each footstep she took seemed to stretch the silence around her until it snapped. She could feel the temperature drop as she got closer to the door, the air becoming thick with an unnatural chill that bit at her skin. She shivered uncontrollably. The doorway was surrounded by more of those strange symbols, glowing and shifting in ways that made Ava's head spin. She could hear whispers, faint and distorted, rising from the threshold. They sounded like voices that didn't belong to any living being. Ava's breath hitched. She felt something brush against the back of her neck and her body froze. Her eyes darted toward the shadows behind her, but she saw nothing. Nothing except the swirling mist that seemed to close in on her with every passing second. She turned her attention back to the doorway, swallowing the lump in her throat. The whispers became louder, the voices more insistent. "Ava, you don't know what you're doing. You don't understand. It's not just the door. It's you. You can't close it. Not alone." The voices weren't just speaking to her, they were coming from within her. They echoed in her mind, taunting her, warning her, and for a moment she almost believed them. Was she really ready to close the door? Could she even do it? Her phone buzzed again and Ava nearly dropped it in shock. She stared at the screen, the words burning into her vision. "The door is your only way out. Close it ***. Ava clenched her fists, gathering every ounce of courage she had left. She couldn't hesitate any longer. If she didn't close the door, she would be trapped here forever, and the creature would find her again. She could feel it creeping closer, its growls rattling her bones. Without thinking, she reached for the door. The moment her fingers brushed against the surface, a violent shock of energy surged through her body. Her skin tingled and her muscles locked in place. The air around her crackled with an electric charge that felt like it could tear her apart. "Ava?" she gasped, her heart racing as the familiar voice, called out to her from the shadows. She recognized it immediately. It was her mother's voice, pleading with her, warning her. "Don't do it, Ava. You don't know what you're unleashing." Her mother's voice was filled with such desperation that Ava's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she wanted to turn back. But then the growls intensified and she remembered the creature, lurking just behind the fog, waiting for her to make a mistake. Ava forced her fingers to grip the door. The energy surged again, this time stronger, as if the door itself was alive. Alive with something ancient, something dark. The symbols around the doorway twisted and writhed as if they were trying to pull her in, sucking her deeper into their grasp. "Ava, listen to me," her mother's voice screamed. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to close it." But Ava was done listening to the voices. She couldn't afford to let doubt paralyze her any longer. She had to close the door. She pushed forward with everything she had. The door didn't budge at first, but then, with a sound like shattering glass, it slammed shut with a deafening crash. For a moment, everything went silent. Ava stood frozen, her breath ragged, her body trembling as she listened for the growls, the whispers, the presence of the creature. But there was nothing. The mist began to recede, the oppressive fog lifting from the field as the faint light from the door faded into nothingness. The air grew warmer, the chill slowly leaving her bones. But it wasn't over. Ava felt something shift behind her. The air grew thick again and she turned slowly, her eyes scanning the now empty space. The growls had stopped, but something worse was beginning to take shape. From the fog, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly tall, its outline indistinct at first, but as it approached, Ava could see the jagged outlines of a twisted face, a face she knew all too well. It was the same face she had seen in her dreams, the one that had haunted her every night since she opened the box. It was no longer just a shadow, no longer just a figment of her imagination. It was real. Ava's pulse raced as the figure moved closer, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. "Did you think you could escape me, Ava?" it whispered, its voice sending a chill through her entire body. Her hands clenched into fists, but she didn't move. She was frozen, caught between the fear of facing it and the need to survive. The figure stopped just in front of her, its breath coming out in sharp, shallow bursts, like the sound of a dying wind. "You've closed the door," it said, its voice almost pitying. "But you've opened something far worse." Ava's chest tightened. "What do you want from me?" The figure leaned closer, its eyes burning into hers, and for a brief moment she could feel its icy touch on her skin. "I want what's mine," it whispered. "And you've given it to me." Before Ava could react, the figure lunged forward, and the world around her twisted into darkness. Ava's scream was cut off as the world around her warped, the darkness swallowing her whole. For a brief moment there was nothing, just an endless void where time and space had no meaning. Her heart hammered in her chest, her body weightless and trapped in a sea of shadows. She couldn't see, couldn't breathe, everything was suffocating, pressing down on her from all sides. Then, just as suddenly, the void released its grip. Ava gasped, her lungs burning for air, and she stumbled forward, the ground beneath her hard and uneven. Her fingers scraped against stone, rough and cold. She blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the dim light that filtered in from somewhere above. It was a faint glow, almost ghostly, but it was enough to make out her surroundings. She was in a cavern. The air was thick with dust and dampness, and the walls stretched up high, disappearing into the shadows above. The stone beneath her hands was slick, covered in some kind of dark, oily residue that made her skin crawl. The smell of decay lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. But what really sent a chill down her spine was the silence. There was no sound here, not even the distant hum of the world outside. Just the oppressive weight of nothingness. Ava pulled herself up to her feet, her legs weak, her body trembling. She didn't know where she was, but she knew one thing for sure. She was not alone. Behind her, a faint scraping sound echoed through the cavern, like claws dragging across stone. Ava froze, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't need to turn around to know what it was. The creature, the thing that had haunted her since the moment she opened the door, was still here. It had followed her into this place. Her hand instinctively reached for her phone, but it was gone. She patted her pockets in a frantic search, but it wasn't there. The terror inside her grew as she realized she was completely alone, completely exposed. A sound broke the silence, a low growl so deep it seemed to vibrate through her bones. It was coming from behind her, getting louder with each passing second. Ava knew she didn't have much time. Turning slowly, she strained her eyes in the darkness, trying to make out any shape in the oppressive shadows. There was nothing at first, just the swirling blackness. But then, just as she thought she might be imagining things, she saw it. A figure, tall and menacing, emerging from the darkness. Its outline was faint at first, like smoke swirling in the air, but it was unmistakable. The same twisted form she had seen before. The creature that had followed her from the field, from the door. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, cold and predatory, and its mouth was stretched into a grotesque, twisted smile. It was alive and it was hungry. Ava took a step back, her feet stumbling over the uneven ground. Her mind raced, her body paralyzed with fear. She had no escape this time. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't fight it. There was nowhere to hide. The creature's growl grew louder, more insistent. Ava's heart pounded in her chest as it took another step toward her, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring her terror. Why are you doing this?" Ava's voice was barely a whisper, but the creature seemed to hear her. It stopped, its head tilting slightly as if considering her words. "You opened the door," it said, its voice low and rasping, filled with malice. "And in doing so, you gave me what I wanted. Now you're mine." Ava's blood ran cold at its words. She didn't understand. She didn't know how, but somehow she knew that it wasn't just after her, it was after something else. Something far worse. Something ancient. She stumbled backward again, her foot catching on a jagged rock. She fell, her palms slamming into the cold stone as she tried to push herself up. The creature took another step forward. She could feel its presence now, its hunger, its need. "I didn't mean to open the door," she gasped, desperation flooding her voice. "I didn't know. I didn't know what it was." The creature's eyes narrowed. It tilted its head again, and this time, Ava felt a strange pressure in her chest, like it was probing her very soul. She gasped, clutching her chest as if trying to hold herself together. "You never do," it said, its voice growing colder, more distant. "You never know what you're really opening when you invite something like me in." Ava didn't know what it meant, but she didn't have time to figure it out. She needed to escape. But how? The cavern was a prison. Every way out was blocked, every path shrouded in shadow. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't want to be here. Please just let me go." The creature stepped forward again, its glowing eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. It reached out one long skeletal arm, and Ava could feel the coldness radiating off it, like a wave of ice washing over her. And then, in a movement that was too fast for her to comprehend, the creature was upon her. Ava screamed, throwing her arms up instinctively, but it was no use. The creature's hand closed around her wrist with an iron grip. She could feel its claws digging into her skin, tearing into her as it dragged her deeper into the cavern. "Stop!" she screamed, but the creature didn't even flinch. It dragged her, pulling her toward a dark, foreboding opening in the distance, an opening she hadn't seen before. There was something inside that made her blood freeze, a feeling of dread so deep she almost wished the creature would kill her now rather than face whatever awaited her beyond that threshold. But she couldn't give up. Not yet. Not like this. With every ounce of strength left in her, Ava yanked her arm free from the creature's grip. The sudden freedom gave her a surge of hope, and she bolted toward the opening, her legs burning as she ran. She could hear the creature's growls behind her, getting closer with every step. But as she neared the opening, a blinding light shot out from the darkness, flooding the cavern and making her squint against the brightness. She didn't hesitate. She leaped forward, diving into the light, hoping against hope that it was her way out. The moment she crossed the threshold, the light enveloped her completely, and the world seemed to vanish. Ava's body jerked as the light engulfed her, a violent pulse of energy that felt like it was ripping her apart. Her vision blurred, her senses spinning in a chaotic whirlwind, and for a moment she thought she might lose her grip on reality. The world she had known seemed to be disintegrating around her, replaced by nothing but a blinding, suffocating light that pressed against her chest, her mind, her soul. Then, as quickly as it had come, the light vanished. Ava collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath, her heart racing in her chest. Her body trembled uncontrollably, the remnants of the intense sensation still reverberating in her bones. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog from her mind, and slowly the world around her came back into focus. She was no longer in the cavern. The air was different here, cool but not the suffocating chill she had felt earlier. It was fresh, almost alive, and there was an overwhelming sense of calm that seemed to settle over her like a blanket. She stood up slowly, looking around, trying to make sense of where she was now. The ground beneath her was soft, covered in a lush, thick carpet of moss. Tall trees stretched up toward the sky, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The forest was dense and dark, but there was an odd stillness to it. No sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves, just complete silence. Felt wrong, like something was missing. Ava's breath caught as she looked at the trees more closely. Their bark was smooth and unnaturally white, like bone. The leaves that clung to the branches were dark, almost black, and they rustled with a noise that sounded wrong. Not like leaves in the wind, but like whispers, soft and eerie, drifting through the air. She felt a shiver run down her spine. This wasn't a normal forest. The weight of the air pressed down on her, making her feel small, insignificant, like she wasn't supposed to be here. Ava took a hesitant step forward, glancing over her shoulder. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that something was watching her from the shadows. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches twisting and turning in unnatural ways, as if they were alive, reaching for her. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. This place wasn't safe. She needed to find a way out, but how? The light had brought her here, but it had taken everything else. Her phone, her bearings, her sense of reality. She had no map, no direction. Just the eerie quiet of the forest and the strange, unsettling atmosphere that clung to the air like a shroud. Another rustle of leaves. Ava spun around, heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't see anything in the shadows, but she could feel it, a presence lurking just out of sight. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and her breath came in quick, shallow bursts. She was being watched. She knew it with every fiber of her being. She began to move, her feet crunching softly on the moss beneath her, but no matter how quickly she moved, the feeling of being followed never left her. The trees seemed to bend and twist around her, their branches creeping toward her as if they were trying to trap her. Ava's pulse raced. She didn't know how she knew, but she could feel something closing in on her. She couldn't stay here. She needed to find a way out, but there was no path, no sign of civilization, nothing but the dark forest and the oppressive quiet that surrounded her. And then, just as the panic began to settle in, she saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the thick trees, there was a figure standing, still and unmoving. Its outline was vague, shadowed by the darkness, but Ava could make out the shape of a person. It was tall, far taller than any human should be, and its form seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if it were something more than flesh and bone. Ava's breath hitched. She didn't want to approach it, but something inside her, a gut feeling, a primal instinct, told her that it was her only chance. If she didn't go toward it, she would never find her way out of this place. With every step she took, the figure seemed to grow clearer. She could see its features now, pale skin, too pale, almost translucent, and eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Its face was twisted, unnaturally stretched, as though it had been distorted by some force beyond comprehension. Ava's heart pounded harder, the fear welling up inside her, but she couldn't turn back now. She was drawn to it, compelled by something she didn't understand. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged her presence, but its eyes never left her. They followed her every movement, their gaze cold, unblinking. When Ava was only a few feet away, the figure finally spoke, its voice like the sound of dry leaves scraping across stone. "You shouldn't be here." The words froze Ava in place. Her mouth went dry, her mind spinning. She wanted to ask what it meant, why she was here, but the words wouldn't come. Her whole body trembled as she waited for the next movement, the next sound. The figure's eyes seemed to glow brighter, their unnatural light pulsing with every beat of her heart. The forest around them seemed to lean in closer, the trees creaking as though they were listening. There was no wind, no movement, just the suffocating pressure of the silence that surrounded them. "You opened the door," the figure said again, its voice quieter now, but still as chilling. "And now there's no turning back." Ava's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? What door?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand, pointing toward something just beyond Ava's line of sight. There, through the dense trees, she saw it. A doorway, faint and glowing like the one she had closed before. The same symbols. The same eerie glow. Her breath caught in her throat. She had seen this before. It was the same doorway, the one that had started all of this. The one she had tried to escape from. And now, here it was again, standing in front of her, beckoning her back. "Why does it keep coming back?" she whispered, more to herself than to the figure. "What does it want with me?" The figure didn't respond immediately. It stood still, its glowing eyes fixed on her as if it were studying her very soul. Finally, it spoke again, its voice softer now, almost sympathetic. "It wants what was lost. What you took." Ava's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fit together in a way she wasn't ready to accept. She had opened something that was never meant to be opened. And now, whatever it was, whatever she had unleashed, was coming for her. "Take it back," the figure said, "before it consumes you all." Ava's legs shook, the weight of the words pressing down on her like a crushing force. She didn't understand, but she didn't have time to figure it out. The doorway beckoned her. It was the only way out, the only way to end this nightmare. But as she took a step forward, the forest around her seemed to shift, the trees closing in tighter, the shadows growing longer. The figure's glowing eyes followed her every movement, its voice a distant echo in her mind. "Be careful, Ava," it warned. "Not all doors are meant to be opened." Ava's breath quickened as she stared at the doorway ahead of her, its soft glow flickering like a heartbeat. Every part of her screamed to run, to escape, to forget everything she had just heard, but there was no turning back now. The figure's warning echoed in her mind, the words pressing against her skull, but it didn't matter. She knew deep down that this was the only way forward. She took another step toward the door, the ground beneath her feet soft and treacherous. The forest, the trees, everything around her seemed to shift and pulse as though it were alive, watching, waiting. It wasn't the peaceful forest it had seemed at first. It was a trap, an unnatural thing that didn't belong in the world she knew. Her legs felt heavy as she moved, the weight of the air around her pressing down on her chest. The glow of the doorway seemed to pulse with every beat of her heart, and as she stepped closer, the whispers in the trees grew louder, more frantic, as if the very forest itself were trying to warn her. But Ava couldn't stop now. She had to know. As she reached out, her fingers brushing against the cool, glowing surface of the doorway, a jolt of cold electricity shot through her body, making her gasp. The air around her crackled with energy, a violent surge of power that rattled her bones. She instinctively pulled her hand back, her pulse thudding in her ears, but the doorway remained. It wasn't going to let her go that easily. And then, without warning, the trees around her began to move. Ava froze, her heart thundering in her chest. The branches reached out like clawed hands, twisting and curling, pulling toward her with an almost desperate urgency. The air around her thickened, and the whispers turned into screams. The forest itself seemed alive, and it wanted her. It wanted her to stay. Panic flooded her veins, but she couldn't move. It was as if the very air had turned to stone, pinning her in place. She could see the figure in the distance, watching her with its cold, glowing eyes, and for the briefest moment she thought she could hear it laughing. Not with joy, but with something else, something darker. The whispers became louder, frantic, like thousands of voices all speaking at once. Ava's mind spun as the voices began to make sense. They were calling her name, each one more desperate than the last. But mixed in with her name were other words, other things she couldn't understand, things that made her skin crawl. And then it hit her. These weren't just voices. They were memories. Faint echoes of things she couldn't remember, things that didn't belong to her, but were somehow connected to her. Things that had been buried for far too long. "Why are you doing this?" Ava gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The forest around her seemed to shift again, the trees bending and groaning like they were alive. The branches stretched toward her, their sharp tips nearly grazing her skin. Every movement felt deliberate, every step closer to her a calculated decision. The figure in the distance stepped forward, its pale skin glowing even brighter in the dim light of the forest. It was closer now, towering over her, its face twisted in an expression of something that might have been pity, if it weren't for the darkness in its eyes. It reached out a hand, its long fingers stretching toward her, beckoning her forward. "You're already too far gone," it said, its voice like the cracking of ice. "It's already too late for you, Ava." Ava took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and she felt the world around her spin. Everything was happening so fast, too fast for her to keep up with. The forest, the figure, the voices. None of it made sense, and yet it all felt familiar. Like something she had known once, something she had forgotten long ago. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't ask for this. I just wanted to leave." But the figure shook its head, a sad, knowing smile spreading across its face. "It's not that simple," it said, its voice low and cold. "You can't leave. Not anymore." Ava's eyes darted around, her mind racing for a solution. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't. There had to be a way out. But the forest around her seemed to close in, the trees now so close she could almost feel their branches brushing against her skin. The whispers, the voices, they were all around her, growing louder, more insistent. And then she saw it. In the distance, beyond the darkness of the trees, a flicker of light. Another doorway. It was almost identical to the first one, but this one was different. It didn't glow with the same eerie, unnatural light. Instead, it seemed to shimmer like it was made of something else entirely, something more solid, more real. Ava's heart raced. This was it. This was her chance. With every ounce of strength, she forced herself to move, breaking free from the grip of the forest. Her legs felt like lead, but she pushed herself forward, one step at a time, toward the doorway. The whispers turned into howls, the trees bending closer as though trying to stop her, but she didn't stop. Closer, closer. The doorway was within reach now. She could almost feel the cool air on the other side, the feeling of freedom, the chance to escape. But just as her fingers brushed the edge of the doorway, she heard the figure's voice again, cold and mocking. "You think it's that easy?" it said. "You think you can just walk away? There's no escaping what you've unleashed. No escaping what you are." The world around her seemed to explode in a burst of light and sound, and for a moment, Ava thought she might lose herself in the chaos. But somehow, she found herself on the other side of the doorway, her body slammed against a cold stone wall. Her breath was ragged, her chest heaving as she struggled to regain her balance. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the chaos stopped. She was standing in a vast, empty hall. The walls were made of cold stone, and the air was thick with dust. There were no windows, no doors, just endless corridors that stretched out in every direction. Ava's heart sank. She wasn't out. She wasn't free. She was in another trap. Ava's mind raced as she stood in the cold, empty hall, her breath visible in the frigid air. The door she had just passed through slammed shut behind her, leaving her in a cavernous space that seemed to stretch on forever. There were no windows, no light except for the faint, eerie glow that seemed to emanate from the stone walls themselves. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and age, as if this place had been abandoned for centuries. But it hadn't. Ava could feel it. She wasn't alone. The silence was unbearable. It pressed against her ears, a silence so thick it almost felt alive. Every time she inhaled, the air felt heavier, like something was waiting, watching, holding its breath. Ava strained her ears for any sound, but there was nothing. Nothing except the echoes of her own heartbeat. She turned slowly, taking in the hall in its entirety. There were no doors, no exits, only narrow passageways that led to unknown corners. The stone beneath her feet felt strangely smooth, almost as if it were polished. The walls were adorned with faded, cryptic carvings, symbols she didn't recognize, but ones that seemed to pulse with energy, like they were trying to communicate with her. A chill ran down her spine. Ava's feet moved almost of their own accord as she walked deeper into the hall. She couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on her, that she was being drawn into something she wasn't meant to understand. The longer she stood still, the more it felt like the very air was pushing against her, urging her forward. But what if that's exactly what it wanted? What if this place was a trap just like the forest? What if there was no way out? Her pulse quickened as the thought crossed her mind. No, she couldn't think like that. She wouldn't let it control her. She had to stay focused. She had to keep moving. The passageways seemed to stretch out before her endlessly, like a maze designed to confuse and disorient. There was no sound, no sign of life, and yet Ava could sense something was there. It was in the way the shadows moved, shifting ever so slightly as if they were aware of her presence. She stopped, her senses on high alert. The shadows seemed to pause for a moment before returning to their slow, deliberate dance. Ava swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. There was no doubt about it now. She wasn't alone in this place. But who, or what, was watching her? Her gaze fell on one of the narrow passageways leading off to the left. It was darker there, the shadows deeper and more suffocating, but there was something else, something that pulled her in. She wasn't sure what it was, but she knew that the answers she sought were through there. Against her better judgment, she stepped toward the opening. The air grew colder with every step she took, and a strange feeling of dread washed over her. The passageway felt wrong, as though it was alive and aware of her presence. The walls pressed in around her as she moved forward, and she could feel the weight of unseen eyes following her every move. Just as she turned the corner, a low creaking sound echoed through the hall, followed by a soft, whispering voice, too soft to understand but unmistakable in its intent. Ava froze, her blood running cold as the voice seemed to come from all around her. "Leave," it whispered, the sound barely more than a breath. Ava's heart skipped a beat. She looked around, but there was no one there. Nothing but the endless passageway stretching out before her. The voice had come from the walls themselves, as though the stones were speaking to her. She could feel the pressure mounting, the sensation of being trapped growing stronger with each passing second. She took another step, and this time the whisper returned, louder and more insistent. "Turn back." But Ava didn't listen. She couldn't. Not now. Not when she was so close to the truth. The passageway seemed to stretch out forever, the walls narrowing until she could barely fit through. The air was thick with an unnatural heaviness, pressing in on her from all sides. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of the darkness closing in. And then, at the end of the passage, she saw it. A door. Or rather, a doorway. It wasn't like the other doors she had encountered. This one was carved from black stone, its edges jagged and rough. The air around it shimmered with an energy she couldn't quite place, but she could feel it, like an invisible hand reaching out to her, pulling her closer. Ava hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. The door wasn't just a door, it was a threshold, a barrier between what was and what could be. She knew this, but something in her warned her not to approach it. She could feel the malevolent presence just beyond the doorway, waiting, watching. But she had to. She had to know. With trembling hands, she reached out to touch the stone. The moment her fingers made contact, the air around her exploded in a burst of heat. The force of it slammed her against the wall, knocking the breath from her lungs. Her head swam as she struggled to stay conscious. The world around her twisted, distorting into a kaleidoscope of colors and shapes. She tried to stand, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to move, shifting like quicksand. And then, with a sudden, violent jolt, everything went still. Ava opened her eyes, but nothing was familiar. She was no longer in the hall, no longer in the passageway. She was somewhere else. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the walls around her damp and covered in strange markings. The shadows loomed larger now, far more oppressive. The very air seemed to pulse with something dark, something ancient. It was the feeling she had sensed all along, the presence that had been lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for her to find it. She wasn't alone. She had never been alone. A deep, guttural voice echoed from the shadows, low and rumbling. "You've made it this far. But do you think you'll survive what comes next?" Ava spun around, but the figure in the darkness was too quick. It appeared in front of her, its features hidden beneath a cloak of shadows, its eyes glowing a faint, sickly yellow. She could feel the weight of its gaze, heavy and suffocating, like it was digging into her very soul. The voice came again, this time closer, almost a whisper in her ear. "There is no escape from this place, Ava. You will never leave. Not now, not ever." Ava's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. Her limbs felt heavy, and for a moment she thought she might fall. But she couldn't. She couldn't let herself give in. There had to be a way out. Ava's chest heaved with each breath, her pulse hammering in her ears as the figure in front of her remained motionless, watching, waiting. Its eyes, those glowing yellow eyes, pierced through the darkness, locking onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach churn. The weight of its gaze felt like a vice around her chest, suffocating her, tightening with every passing second. "You think you're special, don't you?" The voice rumbled again, this time deeper, like the very air around her was vibrating with its power. "You think you're different from the others, the ones who failed before you?" Ava tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. The shadowed figure raised a hand slowly, pointing a finger directly at her. The gesture was deliberate, calculated, as if it knew exactly how much fear it was stirring in her. "No one leaves this place," it said, its voice dropping to a low, terrifying whisper. "No one." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her knees buckled for a moment, and she felt the ground sway beneath her. But she couldn't let herself fall. Not now. She had come too far. Her mind raced. Escape. She needed to escape. But where? Oh. The walls around her seemed to close in tighter, and the air grew thick with an oppressive heaviness that made it almost impossible to think clearly. The figure in front of her had not moved, but she could feel it, its presence growing stronger with every second. There had to be something. There had to be a way out. "Do you hear them?" the voice asked, suddenly soft. Too soft. Almost soothing. "The whispers in the dark? They've been waiting for you. You were always meant to come here, to this very moment. All your choices have led you to this place." Ava's heart skipped a beat. The whispers. She had heard them in the halls, in the shadows, in the silence. At first she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her, but now it felt real. It was as if the very fabric of this place was alive, and it was speaking to her, pulling her in deeper. She forced herself to look up at the figure, trying to ignore the sickly sensation crawling up her spine. The shadows that enveloped it seemed to shift, writhing as if alive, coiling around its form like tendrils of darkness. "I've seen it before," Ava said, her voice trembling, but she steadied herself. You're not the first. Others? They came here too, didn't they?" The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it tilted its head as though considering her words. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Then, with an almost imperceptible motion, it nodded. "Yes," it said finally, its voice cold and emotionless. "Others came. But they couldn't do what you're doing. They couldn't survive the truth. You think you can? You think you're different? You will break just like the rest." Ava's mind raced. Could she survive this? Could she withstand whatever lay ahead? The whispers began again, louder this time, circling her like a swarm of invisible insects. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder, more insistent. Each whisper seemed to tug at her sanity, pulling her toward the edge of something she couldn't comprehend. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her head. It was as though the whispers had pierced her mind, tearing through her thoughts like a knife. She gasped, clutching her skull in agony as the world around her seemed to spin. Her knees hit the cold stone floor and she could barely keep her eyes open. The figure's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "It's too late now. You've already been marked. You belong here, just like the others before you." Ava's vision blurred, her surroundings becoming a haze of shifting shadows and distorted shapes. She felt herself slipping, falling deeper into the darkness. But through the haze, one thought kept cutting through her mind. She couldn't give up. She couldn't let this place claim her. Not like the others. The pain in her head intensified, but Ava gritted her teeth and forced herself to stand. Her body felt weak, but her will was stronger. She could still feel it, the pull of the door, the pull of the unknown. It was like a magnetic force drawing her toward it, urging her to find the answer. "Leave her," a new voice whispered, its tone lighter, almost musical. Ava's eyes snapped open, but she couldn't see where the voice came from. The figure was still there, but now something else lingered in the periphery, a soft glow in the distance, like a distant star. "Oh, who's there?" Ava asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. She felt her legs buckle again, but she managed to stay upright. The glow in the distance flickered and the voice spoke once more. You have to listen. It's not over yet. You still have a choice. You still have a chance to escape. Ava's heart raced, the words ringing in her ears. She had a choice. She wasn't doomed. Not yet. But the figure in front of her stepped forward, blocking her path to the light. There is no escape, it said, its voice harsh, final. This is your fate. Ava took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of the figure's presence, the oppressive force of the darkness pressing in on her, but she refused to let it control her. She refused to let it win. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Ava took a step forward, then another, and another. Each step felt like a battle, each movement a struggle against the pull of the darkness. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Finally, she reached the edge of the figure's shadow, and as she stepped into the faint glow of the distant light, she felt a surge of energy wash over her. The whispers faded, the darkness receded, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. But the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Ava looked ahead, her heart pounding in her chest. The light in front of her pulsed like a heartbeat, and beyond it, she could feel the presence of something ancient and powerful. She wasn't sure what it was, but she knew one thing. If she wanted to survive, she had to face it. And there was no turning back. Ava's breath came in ragged gasps as she stood in the strange light, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Her skin felt cold to the touch, yet the light before her radiated warmth, as if beckoning her forward. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, an otherworldly glow that seemed to stretch and contract in rhythm with her heartbeat. Every fiber of her being screamed to flee, to turn around and escape the unknown, but she couldn't. Not now. Not after everything. The figure, the one that had followed her through the darkness, stood in the shadows behind her, watching her every move. Ava could feel its gaze like a heavy weight pressing down on her, but she refused to turn back. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that followed was deafening. Every step she took felt like it might be her last. The light ahead was becoming more defined now, shaping into something tangible, like a doorway she hadn't seen before, one that hadn't been there when she first entered this forsaken place. It was as if the world around her was folding, shifting, and this doorway had appeared out of nowhere, waiting for her to step through. What is this place? Ava whispered to herself, the words barely escaping her lips. The figure behind her stirred, its voice suddenly cutting through the silence. This is where it all ends. Where it began. Where you will remain. Ava's heart pounded in her chest as she turned her gaze toward the figure, its features still concealed by shadow. The voice was the same, deep and cold, but now it carried an edge of finality, like a door slamming shut behind her. She couldn't let it be the end. She couldn't let it take her. The faint glow of the doorway flickered again, brighter this time, almost impatient, as if urging her forward. She knew what she had to do, but her body felt like it was moving in slow motion. Every muscle screamed in protest, and yet her legs carried her closer to the light. The fear inside her twisted, coiling tighter as she approached the unknown. You can't leave, the figure said, its voice tinged with something dark, something cruel. You're here forever. This is your place now. Ava ignored the voice, her eyes locked on the door. It was close now, so close. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the edge of the doorway. A surge of energy rushed through her at the touch, electric and intense. It felt alive, vibrating with something ancient, something powerful. Suddenly the world seemed to lurch. The doorway pulsed with an intense brightness, blinding her for a moment. She stumbled back, hands raised to shield her eyes from the light. It was too much. Her head spun and her stomach churned, but she couldn't look away. She had to push forward. She had to step through. You are nothing, the figure growled from behind her, its voice now an anguished hiss. You're just another soul who wandered too far. Ava felt a wave of rage surge through her, a burning need to prove that she was more than that. She wasn't like the others. She wouldn't let this place win. She wouldn't let herself become a forgotten name among the countless lost souls. With a scream, Ava threw herself into the light. The world exploded around her, and for a moment she felt nothing but a blinding whiteness, as though every inch of her body was being torn apart and remade. Her ears rang, and her chest ached with the pressure of the transformation. Her entire existence seemed to collapse, folding in on itself as the light consumed her. And then, nothing. For what felt like an eternity, there was only silence. Ava's body felt weightless, suspended in some sort of limbo. Her mind was clouded, as though she was no longer sure where her body ended and the world began. Was she alive? Was she dead? She didn't know. She only knew the deafening silence, the absence of everything. Slowly, a faint sound reached her ears, a distant murmur. At first, it was indistinct, like a conversation happening far away. Then the voice became clearer, more defined. She's here. Ava's heart skipped a beat as she realized the voice wasn't the one she had heard before. It was different. Softer, more familiar, yet tinged with something dark. Her eyes fluttered open, but there was nothing around her. No walls, no figures, no light. Only an endless void stretching in every direction. Her chest tightened, panic rising. Where was she? The murmur grew louder. She's the one, the voice continued, now unmistakable. She is the key. Ava's pulse quickened. Key to what? A figure materialized before her, this one a soft silhouette in the darkness. It was human-shaped, but its features were blurred, as though they were never meant to be seen. It reached out toward her with long ethereal hands, and as it did, Ava felt a strange pull in her chest. You've crossed the line, the figure said, its voice soothing yet chilling. You can never return to what you were. You're not like them anymore. You're more, much more. Ava took a step back, shaking her head. What do you mean? What is this place? What do you want from me? The figure didn't respond immediately. It lingered in front of her, its blurred form shifting in and out of focus like it was trying to decide something, weighing its options. You're the last one, it whispered finally, its voice now more a hiss than a word. The final piece, the last survivor. And now you will become one of us. The words hit Ava like a punch to the gut. She staggered backward, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this a dream? A nightmare? Or had she crossed into some place beyond comprehension? You're the end, the figure continued. And now you will begin the cycle again. Before she could react, everything around her vanished. The figure, the darkness, the light, all of it. The world blinked and she was back. But not in the place she had left. She stood in a room old and forgotten, filled with dust and shadows. It was eerily familiar. She looked down at her hands, but they were different, pale, translucent. Her heart pounded as she realized the truth. She wasn't just trapped. She was the trap. Story 2. It was a moonless night when everything changed for Ethan. He was on his way back from the outskirts of town, driving down a stretch of road he had traveled countless times. The old forest that lined both sides of the narrow path seemed darker than usual, almost as if it was alive, swallowing the faint glow of his car's headlights. There was an unsettling silence. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just the low hum of the car engine and the occasional crunch of gravel under the tires. Ethan glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 11:47 p.m. He sighed, the fatigue of a long day catching up to him. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel and decided to tune the radio to distract himself. Static buzzed through the speakers, but as he turned the knob, something strange happened. A voice cut through the static, faint and barely audible. Help me, please. He froze, his fingers lingering over the dial. The voice was weak, trembling, almost childlike. Ethan turned the volume up, his pulse quickening. Who's there? He muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But as quickly as the voice had appeared, it vanished, replaced by the droning static once more. A chill ran down his spine. Was it a prank? A trick of his tired mind? Shaking his head, he muttered, "Pull yourself together, Ethan." But the unease lingered, gnawing at him. As he approached the sharp curve that marked the halfway point to his house, something caught his eye. Standing by the edge of the road was a figure, a girl in a pale dress, her hair hanging like a curtain over her face. She stood unnaturally still, as though she were waiting for something. Ethan's heart leaped into his throat. He slowed the car, his mind racing. Why would anyone be out here at this hour? Against every instinct screaming at him to keep driving, he rolled down the window just a crack. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. The girl didn't respond. She tilted her head ever so slightly, her face still obscured by her hair. Then, with a deliberate slowness, she raised her arm and pointed deeper into the forest. Ethan's stomach churned. "What's out there?" he asked, more to himself than to her. The girl remained silent, her arm unwavering. The logical part of his brain screamed at him to drive away, but curiosity, or perhaps some unseen force, compelled him to stop the car. He grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out. The night air was biting, filled with the earthy scent of damp leaves and something else, something metallic. He turned back toward the road, but the girl was gone. Ethan's throat tightened. He shone the flashlight around, its beams slicing through the thick darkness. "Hello?" he called out. No answer. Only the sound of his own breathing and the faint rustle of branches in the wind. Against his better judgment, he stepped off the road and into the forest. The trees loomed over him like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The ground was soft and uneven beneath his boots. As he ventured deeper, the metallic scent grew stronger, mingling with the unmistakable stench of decay. The flashlight flickered. Ethan smacked it against his palm, his anxiety mounting. Come on, not now. Just as the light steadied, he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. There, partially buried under a pile of leaves, was a small, weathered locket. He picked it up gingerly, his fingers trembling. The locket was cold to the touch, its surface etched with intricate patterns. He opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of a little girl with bright eyes and a wide smile. A shiver ran through him. She looked eerily familiar. Ethan. The voice was a whisper, barely audible, but it was enough to make him drop the locket. He spun around, shining the flashlight wildly. Who's there? The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees pressing closer, their shadows stretching unnaturally. Then he saw it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the light. It wasn't the girl this time. It was taller, its form distorted as though it didn't belong in this world. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes were empty voids that seemed to swallow the light. Ethan took a step back, his heart pounding like a drum. Ethan, the voice came again, but this time it was right behind him. He turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat. There was nothing there. The locket, now lying in the dirt, began to vibrate, a low hum emanating from it. Ethan didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and bolted back toward the road, his flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. But the road wasn't there. He skidded to a stop, his chest heaving. The path he had come from was gone, replaced by an endless stretch of trees. Panic surged through him. He spun around, desperate to find a way out. Then he heard it, a soft, melodic humming. It was the same tune his mother used to sing to him when he was a child. No, he whispered, shaking his head. This isn't real. This can't be real. But the humming grew louder, closer. And then he saw her. The girl in the pale dress stood just a few feet away, her head bowed. Slowly, she lifted her face to meet his gaze. Her eyes were gone, replaced by gaping black voids that seemed to pull him in. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came out. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears as he stumbled backward, his feet tangling in the underbrush. The girl stood still, her eyeless gaze fixed on him, and the faint humming continued, surrounding him like a suffocating mist. His flashlight flickered again, its weak beam barely holding back the oppressive darkness. Stay away, he shouted, his voice cracking with terror. He groped behind him, desperate to find the path, a rock, anything solid to anchor him to reality. But the girl didn't move. She didn't lunge or speak. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed to the locket still lying in the dirt. The humming stopped. The silence was worse. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. His instincts screamed for him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. Slowly, as if compelled by an invisible force, he crouched down and picked up the locket. The moment his fingers touched the cold metal, the forest erupted into chaos. A deafening roar filled the air, a sound that was neither human nor animal. The trees groaned as if they were alive, their branches reaching out to him. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the metallic scent grew so strong it burned his nostrils. Ethan. The whisper was right next to his ear this time. He spun around, but no one was there. The girl had vanished again, leaving him alone in the writhing darkness. Or so he thought. A shadow moved in the corner of his vision, tall, misshapen, and wrong. Ethan didn't wait to get a better look. He turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the cuts and scratches tearing at his skin. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind racing. What was that thing? What did it want? Asterisk, asterisk. The locket burned in his hand, but he didn't dare drop it. Somehow, he knew it was the key to getting out of this nightmare. The forest seemed endless, the trees stretching impossibly high and closing in around him. The path he thought he was following twisted and turned, leading him in circles. He stumbled over roots and rocks, his body screaming in protest, but he didn't stop. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the chaos stopped. Ethan skidded to a halt, his chest heaving. The forest was silent again, the air unnervingly still. He looked around, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the trees. There was no sign of the creature or the girl. But something was different. The trees no longer looked familiar. Their bark was blackened and cracked, oozing a thick, tar-like substance. The leaves above him were a sickly shade of yellow, and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on him. This wasn't the same forest. Ethan's heart sank as he realized the truth. He wasn't just lost. He was somewhere else entirely. A soft sound broke the silence, a faint tapping like someone drumming their fingers on wood. It was coming from behind him. He turned slowly, every muscle in his body tense. Sitting on a fallen log a few feet away was a man, or at least what used to be a man. His skin was pale and stretched too tightly over his bones, his eyes sunken and lifeless. He wore tattered clothes that looked centuries old, and his fingers drummed rhythmically on the log. The man's head tilted unnaturally as he regarded Ethan with a twisted smile. "You've picked it up, haven't you?" he rasped, his voice dry and brittle like dead leaves. Ethan tightened his grip on the locket. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" The man chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down Ethan's spine. "It's not who I am that matters. It's what you've done. You've taken the locket and now you're marked." "Marked?" Ethan repeated, his voice trembling. "For what?" The man's smile widened, revealing jagged, yellow teeth. "For her. She doesn't let anyone leave. Not with her keepsake." Ethan's stomach churned. "Who's her?" The man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She's the one who watches. The one who waits. And now she's coming for you." Before Ethan could respond, the man's body convulsed violently. His head snapped back, and a guttural scream tore from his throat, echoing through the forest. Ethan stumbled backward, his heart pounding. The man's body twisted and contorted, his limbs bending at impossible angles. Then, with a sickening crack, he collapsed into a pile of ash, the wind scattering him into the air. Ethan stood frozen, his mind reeling. What was happening? How could any of this be real? Asterisk asterisk. The tapping sound returned, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the log anymore. It was coming from the trees. Ethan's flashlight flickered again, and he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Slowly he looked up. The girl was there, perched on a branch like a bird of prey. Her head tilted at the same unnatural angle, and her eyeless sockets bore into him. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, the same haunting hum filled the air. Ethan ran. He didn't care where he was going or what direction he was heading. He just needed to get away. The humming grew louder, chasing him through the twisted forest. His lungs burned and his legs felt like lead, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Then he saw it, a faint light in the distance. Hope surged through him, giving him the strength to push forward. As he got closer, he realized it wasn't just a light. It was a house, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. Ethan burst through the door, slamming it shut behind him. He leaned against it, his chest heaving, his body trembling. But the relief was short-lived. The room was empty except for a single chair in the center. On the chair sat another locket, identical to the one in his hand. And the humming, it was coming from inside the house. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps as he pressed his back against the wooden door, his palms damp with sweat. The room was eerily quiet except for the low, melodic humming that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. His eyes darted around, taking in every detail of the small, dimly lit space. The chair in the center of the room was unnerving, as though it had been placed there deliberately, waiting for him. The second locket rested on the chair, identical in every way to the one he still clenched tightly in his fist. "What is this?" he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the hum. Summoning what little courage he had left, Ethan stepped forward, his boots creaking on the wooden floorboards. The air inside the house felt thick, oppressive, as though it was alive and watching his every move. He hesitated, then reached for the second locket. The moment his fingers brushed against it, a deafening bang erupted behind him. He spun around, heart pounding, but the door was still shut. The sound came again, this time from above, heavy footsteps pacing back and forth on the ceiling. Ethan's chest tightened. Someone, or something, was upstairs. He looked back at the locket on the chair. His mind screamed at him to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible, but his body betrayed him, his hand trembling as it hovered over the strange object. Before he could grab it, a voice whispered from the shadows, soft and chilling. "Ethan, why are you here?" He froze. The voice was familiar, painfully so. Slowly he turned toward the source of the sound. Standing in the corner of the room, shrouded in darkness, was a figure. It stepped forward into the dim light, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was his sister Claire. But it couldn't be. Claire had died 5 years ago in a car accident. He had been there, had seen the wreckage, had held her lifeless body in his arms. "Claire?" he whispered, his voice cracking. She smiled, but it wasn't the warm, comforting smile he remembered. It was cold, twisted, her eyes glinting with something unnatural. "You shouldn't have taken it," she said, her voice layered with an otherworldly echo. Ethan shook his head, backing away. "You're not real. You're not her." Her smile widened. "Aren't I? You've always been stubborn, Ethan. Always needing to see things for yourself. But some doors aren't meant to be opened." As she spoke, the humming grew louder, almost unbearable. Ethan clutched his head, the sound drilling into his skull. The walls seemed to close in, the room distorting around him. "Give it back," Claire said, her voice cutting through the noise. "What?" Ethan gasped, barely able to hear himself over the hum. "The locket," she hissed, her expression darkening. "It doesn't belong to you." Ethan glanced down at the locket in his hand, its surface cold and smooth. His instincts screamed at him to drop it, to throw it as far away as possible, but something about it held him captive. "What happens if I don't?" he asked, his voice shaking. Claire tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "Then she'll come for you. And she won't stop until she has it." A loud crash from upstairs made Ethan jump. The footsteps had stopped, replaced by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. The air grew colder, and frost began to creep along the edges of the windows. "Who is she?" Ethan demanded, turning back to Claire. But she was gone. The chair in the center of the room was empty now, the second locket nowhere to be seen. Ethan's panic swelled as the dragging sound grew louder, moving down the stairs. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs felt like they were encased in cement. Then the humming stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, pressing down on him like a weight. The only sound was the soft creak of the staircase as something descended, step by agonizing step. Ethan gripped the locket in his hand, his knuckles white. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty house. The creaking stopped. For a moment there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just the heavy, suffocating silence. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the door to the room creaked open. Standing in the doorway was the girl. Her pale dress was torn and stained, her hair hanging limply over her face. But this time she wasn't alone. Behind her loomed a shadowy figure, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Its presence was suffocating, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Ethan stumbled backward, his back hitting the wall. "Stay back," he shouted, raising the flashlight. The girl tilted her head, her eyeless sockets locking onto him. She raised her hand and pointed at the locket in his hand. The shadow moved, its form stretching toward him, tendrils of darkness reaching for the locket. Ethan's mind raced, desperate for a way out. Then he remembered the photograph inside. With trembling hands, he flipped the locket open. The faded image of the smiling girl stared back at him, her expression hauntingly serene. Beneath the photograph was an inscription, barely legible in the dim light. "Return what was taken, and you may leave." Ethan's breath hitched. He looked at the girl, then back at the locket. "Is this what you want?" he asked, holding it up. The shadow paused, its tendrils retreating slightly. Summoning every ounce of courage, Ethan hurled the locket toward the girl. It landed at her feet with a soft clink. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the girl bent down and picked up the locket. As she did, the shadow began to recede, its form dissolving into the air. The girl looked at Ethan one last time, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. The house groaned, the walls trembling as if exhaling a long-held breath. The frost melted from the windows and the oppressive weight lifted from the air. Ethan staggered to the door, his legs weak and unsteady. When he stepped outside, the forest was gone. He was back on the road, his car parked where he had left it. The night was calm, the stars twinkling overhead. But as he climbed into the driver's seat, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. Ethan gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The eerie calm of the night felt like a cruel joke after what he had just endured. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, and his heart thudded in his chest like a drum. He glanced at the locket on the passenger seat, the same one he thought he had thrown to the girl. It was back. "Why won't you leave me alone?" he muttered, his voice trembling. He didn't dare touch it again, afraid of what might happen. The road stretched out in front of him, illuminated by his headlights. He didn't know where he was going, but staying still felt like inviting disaster. He started the car and pulled onto the empty road, the sound of the engine oddly soothing in the otherwise silent night. The farther he drove, the more the tension in his chest began to ease. Maybe he had escaped. Maybe the nightmare was finally over. But then the radio crackled to life. Static filled the car, sharp and grating, making Ethan jump. He reached to turn it off, but a voice broke through the noise, soft and distorted. "You can't run from her, Ethan." He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. His hands shook as he stared at the radio, which had gone silent again. The voice had sounded so close, as though someone had been sitting right next to him. A chill ran down his spine as he realized he wasn't alone. Slowly, he turned his head toward the passenger seat. The girl was there. Her pale face was inches from his, her eyeless sockets staring into his soul. Her lips didn't move, but he heard her voice in his head, clear and sharp. "You took it, Ethan. You'll never be free." Ethan screamed and flung open the driver's side door, stumbling out onto the asphalt. He fell to his knees, gasping for air, his vision swimming. When he looked back at the car, the passenger seat was empty. The locket, however, was gone. He didn't know whether to feel relief or terror. As he sat there, trembling in the middle of the road, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. He scrambled to his feet and turned, but there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a faint whispering. It seemed to come from all around him, growing louder with each passing second. "She sees you, Ethan. She's always watching." The whispers coalesced into a low, guttural growl. The air grew colder, and the stars above seemed to dim. Ethan backed away, his legs shaking, until he hit something solid. He spun around to see a massive tree that hadn't been there moments before. Its twisted branches loomed over him like skeletal fingers, and its bark was marked with strange, pulsating symbols that seemed to writhe under his gaze. At the base of the tree was a small, hollowed-out cavity. Inside was the locket. Ethan's stomach churned. He didn't want to touch it again, but something about the tree compelled him. It felt alive, its presence oppressive and malevolent. As he reached out to grab the locket, a hand shot out from the hollow, pale and gnarled, grabbing his wrist with inhuman strength. "You can't escape her, Ethan," a voice rasped, its tone dripping with malice. Ethan screamed and yanked his arm free, stumbling backward. The hand retreated into the hollow, and the locket fell to the ground. "Why me?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the still night. "What does she want from me?" The tree groaned, its branches swaying as if responding to his question. A sharp wind picked up, carrying with it a chorus of voices, angry, sorrowful, pleading. "She wants what was taken," the wind seemed to whisper. "And she won't stop until it's returned." Ethan shook his head, his mind racing. He had no idea what they were talking about. He hadn't taken anything. He had stumbled upon the locket by accident. Unless... His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car engine in the distance. Headlights appeared on the horizon, growing brighter as the vehicle approached. Desperation surged through him. He ran into the middle of the road, waving his arms. "Stop. Please stop." The car slowed and came to a halt a few feet away. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out, a tall, wiry figure with a weathered face and piercing eyes. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the man said, his voice calm but tinged with suspicion. Ethan didn't know where to begin. "You have to help me. There's someone, after me. I don't know what to do." The man's gaze shifted to the tree behind Ethan, his expression hardening. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. Ethan frowned. "What do you mean? Do you know what's going on?" The man nodded slowly. "This place isn't on any map for a reason. People who come here don't leave the same. If they leave at all." Ethan's blood ran cold. "But I didn't mean to come here. I didn't mean to take the locket." The man's eyes narrowed. "The locket, huh? Then you're in deeper than most?" Before Ethan could respond, the man turned and walked back to his car. He opened the trunk and pulled out a battered leather bag. "Come with me," he said. Ethan hesitated. "What? What are you going to do?" The man glanced at him, his expression grim. "If you want to survive the night, you'll need my help. But it won't be easy. She doesn't let go of her prey lightly." Ethan didn't have a choice. He followed the man toward the tree, the locket glinting ominously in the faint moonlight. Ethan hesitated at the base of the tree, staring at the gnarled trunk as the man rummaged through his leather bag. The tree's pulsating symbols seemed alive, glowing faintly in the dark as if taunting him. The man finally pulled out a bundle wrapped in coarse cloth and unrolled it on the ground. Inside were items that looked like they belonged in an ancient ritual. A rusty dagger, small glass vials filled with dark liquids, and a weathered book with a cover so old it seemed ready to crumble. "Listen to me carefully," the man said, his voice low but firm. "If you want to walk away from this, you'll need to follow every instruction I give you. No questions. No hesitation." Ethan's throat felt dry. "What is this? What's happening to me?" The man's eyes narrowed. "She's marked you. That locket binds her to you now. It wasn't just an accident you found it, it called to you. And now she'll stop at nothing to get what she wants." Ethan's stomach churned. "Who is she?" The man sighed, his expression dark. "She's been called many names over the years, but most just know her as the girl. She's a spirit, a curse, a predator. She was wronged a long time ago, and her rage has festered ever since. That locket is all she has left of what was taken from her, and anyone who touches it becomes her target." Ethan's mind raced, trying to process what he was hearing. "So what do I do? How do I stop her?" The man held up the weathered book. "This is the only thing that's ever worked. It's not just a ritual, it's a test. She'll come for you during it, and you'll have to prove your will to survive. If you fail, she'll take you. Forever." Ethan's pulse quickened. "And if I pass?" The man's gaze was steady. "Then she'll release you. But she doesn't make it easy. Most don't survive." A low growl rumbled from the tree, the symbols glowing brighter as the air grew colder. The man stood, his expression unyielding. "We don't have much time. Are you ready?" Ethan swallowed hard. "Do I have a choice?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he began to draw a circle around the tree using the dark liquid from one of the vials. The air seemed to hum with energy as he worked, the symbols on the tree writhing as if in protest. "Stand in the circle," the man ordered. Ethan stepped into the circle, his heart pounding. The man handed him the rusty dagger, its blade cold and heavy. "This will be your only defense," he said. "But be warned, she's not just going to come at you physically. She'll dig into your mind, your memories, your fears. She'll show you things that'll make you want to give up. You can't let her win." Before Ethan could respond, the man began to chant, his voice low and rhythmic. The ground beneath them trembled, and the symbols on the tree flared with blinding light. The air around them grew thick and oppressive, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, taking on unnatural shapes. Ethan gripped the dagger tightly, his knuckles white. Then the humming started again. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder and more intense with each passing second. Ethan's vision blurred, and his head throbbed as the sound pierced his skull. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. The shadows were no longer just shapes. They were figures, writhing and shifting, their forms grotesque and ever-changing. One of them stepped forward, and Ethan's blood turned to ice. It was Claire. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and empty. She reached out to him, her voice soft but filled with sorrow. "Ethan, why didn't you save me?" Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "You're not real. This isn't real." She took another step forward, her expression pained. "You let me die, Ethan. You could have stopped it, but you didn't. You failed me." Ethan's grip on the dagger faltered. "No, I didn't. I tried to save you." Her form began to twist and distort, her face melting into something monstrous. "Liar, she screamed, her voice echoing like thunder. The man's chanting grew louder, breaking through Ethan's terror. Focus, Ethan. She's trying to break you. Don't let her in. Ethan shook his head, forcing himself to look away. The ground beneath him cracked and split, flames licking at the edges of the circle. The tree groaned, its branches writhing like serpents. Then she appeared. The girl. She emerged from the shadows, her pale dress fluttering in an invisible wind, her eyeless sockets fixed on Ethan. The air grew colder as she approached, her presence suffocating. Give it back, she said, her voice hollow and echoing. Ethan raised the dagger, his hands trembling. Stay back. She didn't stop. The shadows around her surged forward, clawing at the edges of the circle. The man's chanting faltered, his voice strained. She's breaking through, he shouted. You have to face her, Ethan. It's the only way. Ethan's mind raced, fear gripping him like a vice. He took a shaky step forward, the dagger heavy in his hand. What do you want? He demanded, his voice cracking. The girl tilted her head, her expression unreadable. You took what was mine, she said. Now you must pay the price. Ethan's anger flared. I didn't take anything. I don't even know how I got here. The girl's form flickered, her voice growing colder. Lies won't save you, Ethan. The ground beneath him crumbled, and he felt himself falling, the world dissolving into darkness. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the circle. He was standing in a room, his childhood bedroom. The locket was on the desk, glowing faintly. You know what you took, the girl's voice whispered in his ear. You've always known. Ethan's heart sank as memories flooded back. Memories he had buried deep, too painful to confront. The truth was undeniable now, and he realized with chilling clarity that the nightmare was far from over. Ethan's childhood bedroom looked exactly as he remembered it, down to the faded wallpaper, the chipped corners of his wooden desk, and the single flickering bulb that cast long, distorted shadows across the room. But something felt off, like the air itself carried a weight that pressed on his chest, making it hard to breathe. The locket on the desk gleamed unnaturally, its glow pulsing like a heartbeat. Ethan's legs felt like lead as he approached it, each step heavier than the last. You know what you did? The girl's voice whispered again, soft but piercing. Ethan's heart pounded as the memories began to surface, fragments of a time he had tried to forget. He had seen this locket before. Not just tonight, not just in the forest, it had been in his family's house years ago. Why is this happening? He muttered, his voice trembling. The room suddenly shifted, the walls warping and twisting, turning the familiar space into a distorted nightmare. The desk elongated, its edges curling like claws, and the floor seemed to ripple beneath his feet. Ethan stumbled backward, his breathing shallow. The locket floated off the desk, hovering in the air before him. You took her from me, the girl's voice hissed louder now. You and your family. You buried the truth, but it can't stay hidden forever. What are you talking about? Ethan shouted, his voice cracking. I didn't take anyone. I don't even know you. The room exploded with sound, a deafening cacophony of wails, screams, and whispers. The walls bled a dark, viscous liquid, and the shadows in the corners of the room grew larger, more menacing. The locket shot toward Ethan, and he instinctively raised his arms to shield himself. But instead of striking him, it stopped mere inches from his chest and began to burn with an intense light. Images flashed in his mind, blurry at first, but becoming clearer with each pulse of the locket's glow. He saw a little girl playing in a field of wildflowers, her laughter echoing in the warm summer air. She wore the locket around her neck, her small hands clutching it as if it were her most prized possession. Then came the fire. The field was engulfed in flames, the girl's laughter replaced by screams. Ethan saw himself as a child, standing at the edge of the field, watching as the inferno consumed everything. He remembered now. The fire had started near his family's cabin. He had been told to stay inside, but curiosity had drawn him out. He had wandered too close to the flames, and that's when he had seen her, the girl trapped in the blaze. She had screamed for help, reaching out toward him, but he had been too scared. He had run back to the cabin, leaving her behind. No, Ethan whispered, shaking his head. I was just a kid. I didn't know what to do. The girl's figure materialized in the room, her eyeless sockets fixed on him. You left me to burn, she said, her voice filled with pain and rage. And then your family took what was mine. What are you talking about? Ethan asked, his voice breaking. What did they take? The girl's form flickered, her voice rising to a scream. The locket. It was all I had left, and your family stole it. You hid it, buried it, and now it's your curse to bear. The room trembled, the walls cracking and splitting as the girl's rage filled the space. Ethan fell to his knees, clutching his head as her screams pierced his mind. I'm sorry, he shouted, tears streaming down his face. I didn't know. I didn't mean to leave you. The girl's screams subsided, replaced by an eerie silence. She knelt before him, her pale, gaunt face inches from his. Sorry won't bring me peace, she whispered. But there's a way you can atone. Ethan looked up, his vision blurred by tears. What do you want me to do? The girl pointed to the locket, which now floated between them. Return it to where it belongs. Take it back to the place where I died. Only then will I rest. Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. But what if I fail? The girl's expression didn't change. If you fail, you'll join me. Forever. The locket dropped into Ethan's hands, its cold surface sending a shiver through his body. The room began to dissolve, the walls and floor crumbling into darkness. When the world reformed around him, he was standing in the middle of the forest again. The tree loomed before him, its twisted branches silhouetted against the night sky. The man was gone, and the circle had disappeared. Ethan clutched the locket tightly, his resolve hardening. He didn't know how he was going to find the place where the girl had died, but he knew he didn't have a choice. The forest was silent now, the oppressive atmosphere replaced by an eerie calm. But Ethan knew better than to trust it. The girl wasn't done with him yet. He took a step forward, the ground crunching beneath his feet. The shadows seemed to move with him, their forms flickering and shifting as if watching his every move. A soft whisper carried through the trees, chilling him to the bone. She's waiting, Ethan. Ethan stood at the edge of the forest, clutching the locket so tightly that its sharp edges bit into his palm. His breathing was ragged, his pulse erratic. The stillness around him wasn't comforting, it was oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. The girl's voice echoed in his mind, soft but insistent. Return it to where it belongs. But how? How was he supposed to find the spot where she had died? The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, a labyrinth of trees and shadows that seemed to shift and twist when he wasn't looking. Then faintly he heard it, a melody. It was barely audible at first, carried on the wind like a distant memory. A lullaby hauntingly beautiful and achingly familiar. He couldn't place where he had heard it before, but it stirred something deep within him, a mixture of longing and dread. The melody seemed to call to him, pulling him forward. His feet moved of their own accord, the locket growing warmer in his hand with each step. The forest around him grew darker, the trees closing in like silent sentinels. Ethan's mind raced as he walked, fragments of memories surfacing like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite put together. He remembered the fire, the girl's screams, and the way her outstretched hand had disappeared into the flames. But there was something else, something he had buried even deeper. The lullaby grew louder, more insistent, and the forest seemed to shift around him, guiding him. The path beneath his feet became uneven, roots and stones jutting out to trip him up. He stumbled but kept going, driven by a force he couldn't explain. After what felt like hours, he emerged into a clearing. The air here was colder, heavier, and the ground was scorched black as if the fire from his childhood had never fully extinguished. In the center of the clearing stood a charred tree, its twisted branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. Ethan's stomach churned. He recognized this place. This was where it had happened. He approached the tree cautiously, the locket in his hand growing almost unbearably hot. The melody was deafening now, resonating in his bones. The girl appeared suddenly, standing beneath the tree. Her pale dress was tattered and stained, and her eyeless socket seemed to pierce straight through him. "You've returned," she said, her voice hollow. Ethan nodded, his throat too dry to speak. He held up the locket, his hand trembling. "I brought it back," he managed to say. The girl didn't move. "Do you think it's that simple?" Ethan frowned. "What do you mean? You told me to bring it back." The girl's expression twisted into something cruel. "You think returning the locket will erase what you did? You think it will make me forgive you? I was just a kid." Ethan shouted, his voice cracking. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The girl's form flickered, and the air around her seemed to ripple with anger. You ran. You left me to die. And now you'll face the same fate. The ground beneath Ethan's feet began to crack and split, glowing red as if the earth itself were bleeding. The charred tree groaned, its branches writhing like living things. Shadows emerged from the darkness, their forms twisted and grotesque. They circled the clearing, their hollow eyes fixed on Ethan. The girl stepped closer, her voice a whisper that cut through the chaos. You will atone, Ethan. But first you must remember. Remember what? He demanded, panic rising in his chest. She reached out and touched his forehead with an icy finger. The world around him dissolved. Ethan was no longer in the clearing. He was back in the field of wildflowers, but this time it wasn't burning. The sun shone brightly overhead, and the air was filled with the scent of blossoms. He saw himself as a child, running through the field with laughter in his voice. But he wasn't alone. A little girl ran beside him, her dark hair flowing in the wind. She wore the locket around her neck, its silver surface catching the sunlight. Ethan's chest tightened. He knew her. Her name was Lily. The memories came flooding back. Memories he had buried so deeply they felt like someone else's life. Lily had been his friend, his closest companion during those endless summers at the cabin. They had played together in the field, explored the forest, and shared secrets. But one day everything changed. He remembered the fight. It had been over something small. He couldn't even recall what, but it had escalated quickly. Harsh words were exchanged, and in his anger, Ethan had snatched the locket from Lily's neck. You don't deserve this, he had shouted, running off with the locket in his hand. Lily had chased after him, tears streaming down her face. That's when the fire started. Ethan had made it back to the cabin, clutching the locket, but Lily hadn't. He had watched from the window as the flames consumed the field, too scared to go back for her. When the fire was finally extinguished, there was no sign of Lily. The adults said she must have wandered off, but Ethan had known the truth. And he had kept the locket, hiding it away as a reminder of his guilt. The memory faded, and Ethan was back in the clearing. The girl, Lily, stood before him, her expression unreadable. You remember now, she said. Ethan's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground. I'm so sorry, Lily. I was a coward. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Lily stepped closer, the shadows retreating as she approached. Sorry won't bring me back, but maybe it can bring you peace. She held out her hand. Ethan hesitated, then placed the locket in her palm. The moment the locket touched her skin, it glowed with a brilliant light, and the shadows dissolved completely. The charred tree began to bloom, its branches sprouting vibrant green leaves. Lily smiled, a sad, haunting smile, and began to fade. Goodbye, Ethan, she said softly, and then she was gone. The forest was silent once more, but this time the silence felt peaceful. Ethan stood alone in the clearing, the weight of his guilt lifted but the scars of his actions still fresh. He knew he would never forget Lily or what had happened, but he also knew he had been given a second chance. He turned and walked away, the forest parting before him as if to guide him home. Ethan emerged from the forest with shaky legs and a hollow feeling in his chest. The dawn's first light painted the sky with streaks of orange and pink, but its warmth couldn't touch the chill that had seeped into his bones. He glanced back at the tree line, half expecting the forest to pull him back into its dark embrace, but it remained still, silent and unyielding. The locket was gone. The weight that had pressed on him for so long had vanished with it, leaving a strange emptiness in its place. For the first time in years his mind felt quiet. Yet the calm was short-lived. As he made his way down the dirt path toward his family's cabin, a deep unease began to take root. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The cabin came into view, its weathered walls and sagging roof exactly as he'd left them. But something was different. The windows, usually dark and empty, now glowed faintly with an amber light. Ethan froze. He hadn't left any lights on when he'd stormed out the night before. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. He stepped closer, his heart hammering in his chest. The air around the cabin felt heavy, charged with a strange energy that made his skin prickle. He pushed open the door, and the sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. The living room was untouched, just as he remembered it, down to the worn-out armchair and the faded rug. But the air was thick with the scent of smoke, and faint whispers seemed to echo from the walls. "Ethan?" The voice was soft, almost melodic, but it made his blood run cold. He spun around, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice rising. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a cyclone. The walls seemed to pulse, the faded wallpaper bubbling and cracking as if alive. Then, the light bulb in the center of the room flickered and exploded, plunging the cabin into darkness. Ethan stumbled back, his breath coming in short gasps. No, this can't be happening. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Lily, but she wasn't the same. Her pale dress was now pristine, free of the tattered edges and stains, and her face was no longer hollow and gaunt. Yet her eyes, or the empty voids where they should have been, still carried the weight of something otherworldly. "Lily?" Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. She tilted her head, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyeless sockets. "Did you think it was over, Ethan? That giving me the locket would erase everything?" Ethan shook his head, his throat tight. I thought you found peace." Lily laughed, a sound that sent shivers down his spine. "Peace? Do you think peace is so easily earned?" The room shifted around them, the walls stretching and warping. The furniture dissolved into ash, leaving the two of them standing in an endless void. "You're still hiding something," Lily said, stepping closer. "You've always been good at burying the truth, haven't you?" Ethan backed away, his pulse pounding in his ears. "I don't know what you're talking about." Lily's smile faded. "Yes, you do." She reached out and touched his chest with an icy finger. Ethan gasped as a searing pain shot through him, and his mind was flooded with images. A second memory surfaced, one he had buried even deeper than the first. It was the night of the fire. Ethan was huddled in the cabin, clutching the locket, when he heard a sound outside, a faint cry. He had peeked out the window and seen Lily, her small figure silhouetted against the flames. She was alive, but barely. Her hand had clawed at the ground, dragging her burned body toward the cabin. Ethan had turned away. "No," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't." "You left me," Lily said, her voice cold. "Even when you could have saved me, you turned your back." "I was scared," Ethan cried. "I didn't know what to do." Lily's face twisted with anger. "You didn't even try." The void around them began to collapse, the darkness folding in on itself. Ethan fell to his knees, clutching his head as the memories overwhelmed him. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry." Lily knelt before him, her expression softening. "It's not enough, Ethan. Not yet." "What do you want from me?" he pleaded. "You have to remember everything," she said. "Every lie, every truth you've buried. Only then will it end." The void shattered, and Ethan found himself back in the cabin. But it wasn't the same. The walls were covered in charred handprints, and the whispers were louder now, more insistent. Objects floated in the air, spinning and colliding with each other. Ethan staggered to his feet, his mind racing. He needed to get out. But the door was gone. "You can't run this time," Lily's voice echoed. "Face it, Ethan. Face what you've done." A mirror appeared on the wall, its surface cracked and streaked with soot. Ethan approached it cautiously, his reflection distorted and broken. As he stared, the mirror began to ripple, and a new image appeared. It was a young boy, Ethan as a child, standing over something. He couldn't make out what it was at first, but then the image became clear. It was Lily's body. Ethan stumbled back, shaking his head. No, that's not possible." The mirror shattered, and Lily's voice filled the room. "The truth, Ethan. It's time to face it." The cabin began to collapse around him, the walls caving in as the floor crumbled beneath his feet. And then everything went black. Ethan's eyes opened slowly, the sharp edge of his breath cutting through the darkness as his chest heaved, struggling to keep up with the memory of what had just unfolded. The last thing he remembered was falling, feeling the weight of the earth around him collapse as the shadows reached up, pulling him back into the world of nightmares. But now he was here, alone. His body lay still, the cool air of the room brushing against his skin like the gentle caress of reality. There was no weight in his chest, no pressing fear, no scream in his mind that begged for him to wake up. Ethan sat up, looking around in confusion. It was quiet. Too quiet. The room was still, exactly as it had been before the haunting took place, but the air felt different now. It was warm, suffused with the softness of early morning light filtering through the curtains. But the question lingered in the back of his mind, one he could never quite shake. Was it real? He reached out instinctively, his fingers grazing the place on his chest where the locket had once rested. It was gone, and with it, the heavy sense of responsibility and guilt that had clung to him. The sensation was gone, leaving an aching emptiness in its wake. Ethan wasn't sure whether that was a relief or a curse. He stood, the floor creaking beneath his feet as he walked toward the window. Outside, the world was beginning to wake up, the golden light spilling over the horizon like liquid fire. Birds chirped in the distance, and the wind whispered through the trees. Everything seemed so normal, and yet nothing would ever be the same. The memories of Lily, the fire, the terrible choices he made, and the unspoken consequences they had carried, weighed heavily on him. But now, as he stood alone in the quiet stillness of the room, he realized something. He would never truly escape the past. The sound of a door creaking broke the silence. Ethan froze, his heart thudding in his chest. He didn't have to look to know who it was. He felt it, her presence, that same chill that would never leave him now. The footsteps that followed were slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. He didn't turn to face her. He didn't need to. Lily appeared in the doorway, her figure emerging from the shadows like a ghost, a pale reflection of the girl he had once known. But this wasn't the same Lily. This one had no warmth in her, no memory of their shared childhood. This Lily was a manifestation of everything Ethan had lost, and everything he had feared. "You didn't think I was gone, did you?" Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, something that made Ethan's skin crawl. He didn't speak. His throat was too tight, too full of the words he wanted to say but couldn't find the strength to utter. What was there to say? Sorry? Sorry would never be enough. Not after everything he had done. Not after running when she needed him most. "I don't know why I thought I could escape this," Ethan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily tilted her head slightly, the empty sockets where her eyes once were fixated on him, yet there was no judgment in her gaze, only a sorrow so deep it resonated in the air between them. "You never escaped, Ethan," she said. "You've been running for years, but you can't outrun your own mistakes. You can't outrun me." Ethan swallowed hard, trying to find words to explain, to beg for forgiveness, to make sense of everything. But how could he? How could anyone explain the feeling of watching someone you love slip away, knowing you had the power to save them but chose not to? How could you explain the way that guilt ate at your soul, gnawing at the very core of your being until you were nothing but a hollow shell? He took a step forward, his legs shaky. He had to do this. He had to face her. Had to face himself. I didn't know what to do. I was so scared. I didn't know how to help you. I thought if I just left it behind, it would all go away. But it didn't. It never did. Lily didn't speak at first. She simply watched him, her face unreadable. The stillness stretched on for what felt like eternity. Then, softly, she spoke. "You left me, Ethan, and I've been waiting. Waiting for you to come back. Waiting for you to remember. For you to understand." Her voice trembled at the last words, and for a brief moment, there was a crack in her cold, ethereal facade. Ethan's heart clenched. He wanted to run to her, to hold her, to make up for the years he had lost, but he knew that would never be enough. Not now. Not ever. "I'm sorry," he said, the words choking in his throat. "I can't change what happened, but I want you to know. I'll never forget you. Never. I'll carry the weight of what I did every day, and I'll live with it always." Lily smiled then. It was a soft smile, though it didn't reach her empty eyes. She stepped closer to him, her form flickering like a mirage, as though she were made of the very air itself. She reached out, brushing her cold fingers against his cheek. "It's too late for apologies, Ethan. But you finally learned. You finally understood. That's all I needed from you." With that, Lily stepped back, her form dissolving into the shadows that crept around the room. The light from the window dimmed, and for a brief moment, Ethan thought he saw her standing there, watching him. But when he blinked, she was gone. Ethan stood in the silence, his body trembling as if it had been deprived of life for too long. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, the weight of what had transpired settling in like a burden that would never be lifted. The room was still, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind outside. He was alone again. But this time he wasn't running. For the first time in his life, Ethan understood. The past couldn't be erased. The mistakes couldn't be undone. He couldn't change what he had done or what he had failed to do. He couldn't bring Lily back, no matter how much he wished it. But he could carry the memory of her with him. He could live with the guilt, the lessons, and the understanding that sometimes we make mistakes that we can never repair. And that, perhaps, was the only truth that mattered. Ethan walked to the window once more, looking out at the world. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the landscape. It was beautiful, serene. But he knew that life was never as simple as it seemed. With a final deep breath, Ethan turned away from the window. He would live with this, with the knowledge that some ghosts could never be laid to rest. But he would not run anymore. He would face whatever came next, whether it was in this world or the next. The past had shaped him, yes, but it would never define him again. Story 3. It started with a sound no one else seemed to hear, a faint, rhythmic tapping in the middle of the night. Olivia thought it was her mind playing tricks on her, just another oddity in the old house she had reluctantly moved into. But as the tapping grew louder and began echoing through the empty hallways, she realized something was terribly wrong. At first, it was easy to explain away. The creaks in the floorboards? Probably the house settling. The chill in the air? An old heating system, nothing more. But when she found the first note, scribbled hastily in what looked like smudged ink, or was it something darker? Her stomach knotted. "Don't look behind you," it read. For a full minute, Olivia froze. The word seemed like a cruel joke, left by someone who knew exactly how to tap into her worst fears. Her breath caught as a soft creak echoed from behind. Her hands trembled as she forced herself to turn, but there was nothing. Just shadows pooling in the dim light of the hallway. The next morning, she convinced herself it had been a dream. After all, she had been under a lot of stress lately. The move, the breakup, starting a new job in a town where she didn't know a soul. It made sense that her mind might conjure something to match the unease she felt. But when the second note appeared, this time pinned to her bathroom mirror, she knew it wasn't her imagination. "You're not alone," it said. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and wide-eyed, as if even her own image didn't trust her anymore. The message wasn't written in ink this time. It was scratched into the glass. She tried calling the landlord, only to find the number disconnected. The neighbors were no help either, their faces tightening as soon as she mentioned the house. One elderly woman whispered, "You should leave before it starts." Olivia didn't have the chance to ask her what she meant before the woman closed the door, leaving her standing there with a growing sense of dread. By the third night, the tapping became a relentless pounding. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, an impossible noise that rattled her nerves. When Olivia screamed for it to stop, the silence that followed was almost worse. She held her breath, waiting, and then came the laugh, a low, guttural sound that didn't belong to any human throat. That's when she decided she needed answers. She started searching the house, room by room, for any clue about what was happening. It was in the attic, behind an old wardrobe covered in dust, that she found the box. It was small and unassuming, wrapped in faded paper and tied with a frayed ribbon. When she opened it, her heart nearly stopped. Inside was a collection of photographs, all of them showing her in various moments of her life, as a child playing in her backyard, as a teenager at her high school prom, and most chillingly, a picture of her standing in the very attic she was in now, taken from a vantage point that suggested someone had been watching her. Her hands shook as she rifled through the photos, each one more invasive than the last. At the bottom of the box was a single cassette tape. She didn't own a player, but the label on it was enough to send her spiraling into panic. It read, *, "Listen to me, *. Olivia knew she couldn't stay in the house another night, but as she turned to leave, she felt it, a presence, cold and suffocating, looming just behind her. She didn't dare look back this time. Instead, she ran, the box clutched tightly to her chest, as if holding onto it might somehow protect her. When she reached the front door, she yanked it open and was met with a wall of blackness. Not the kind of darkness that comes with nightfall, but an all-consuming void that seemed to swallow sound and light alike. She stumbled back, her mind racing with thoughts that didn't make sense. And then came the voice, soft and menacing, whispering her name as if it had been waiting all along. Olivia stood frozen, staring into the void that had replaced her front yard. Her chest heaved, each breath shallow and desperate as the voice whispered her name again, this time closer, almost intimate, as though it was brushing against her ear. "Olivia." The sound sent a chill racing down her spine, rooting her feet to the creaking wooden floor. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, she slowly backed away, shutting the door with trembling hands. But as soon as it clicked shut, she felt the house itself shift, as if it had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. The silence was oppressive, pressing against her temples until she thought she might scream just to break it. But then she noticed something worse. The box she had been clutching so tightly was gone. Her fingers curled into empty air where it should have been, and a cold wave of terror swept through her. She spun around, searching the floor and the shadows, but there was nothing, not even the faintest trace of the photographs or the cassette tape. Her mind raced. Asterisk, had she dropped it? Had someone taken it? Asterisk. She didn't have time to finish the thought. The pounding returned, louder and more forceful this time, as if the walls themselves were being battered. Asterisk, boom, 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 asterisk. It was coming from upstairs. Her throat tightened. She wanted to run, to leave this cursed place behind and never look back. But something held her there, an invisible force compelling her to climb the stairs. Each step groaned under her weight, the sound magnified in the suffocating quiet. When she reached the top, she saw it. The attic door was wide open, swinging slightly as though beckoning her. A faint light pulsed from within, weak and sickly, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. She hesitated, but the same compulsion that had brought her here pushed her forward. The attic smelled of mildew and decay, a stench so thick it made her gag. She covered her mouth with her sleeve as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of the box. But instead of finding it, her gaze landed on something far more disturbing. In the center of the attic was a chair, old and splintered, with thick ropes coiled around its arms and legs as if waiting for a prisoner. Behind it, scrawled in what looked like dried blood, were the words, Asterisk, you can't leave. Asterisk. Her knees buckled, and she stumbled backward, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. She turned to flee, but the attic door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The light flickered, casting grotesque shapes on the walls that seemed to move of their own accord. And then she felt it again, that presence, cold and malevolent, filling the room like a poisonous fog. She didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see what was behind her, but she couldn't stop herself. Slowly, she pivoted, and what she saw nearly stopped her heart. It wasn't a person, not exactly. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long and bent at horrifying angles. Its face, or what passed for one, was a blank, featureless void, as black and consuming as the darkness outside her door. It tilted its head as if studying her, and then it spoke without a mouth. Asterisk, why do you run, Olivia? You've always belonged here. Asterisk. Her scream tore through the silence, raw and primal, but the figure didn't flinch. It simply reached out one of its spindly arms, and the air around her seemed to warp, bending toward it like a vortex. She stumbled back, her hands searching blindly for something, anything, to defend herself. Her fingers closed around a rusted iron bar lying among the clutter, and without thinking, she swung it with all her strength. The figure didn't dodge. The bar passed through it as though it wasn't there, and yet Olivia felt the impact reverberate up her arm, as if she had struck something solid. The figure shuddered, its form flickering like a glitch in a video. And then it vanished. The attic was silent again, the oppressive presence gone, but Olivia knew better than to think she was safe. She bolted for the door, yanking it open and racing down the stairs. When she reached the living room, she stopped short. The box was sitting on the coffee table, its lid slightly ajar. Her stomach churned as she approached it, half expecting the figure to reappear at any moment. But when she peeked inside, she found something new, a small black key, cold and heavy in her hand. There was no note this time, no cryptic warning or explanation, but she knew instinctively that the key was important. The question was, where did it lead? Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud knock at the door. Asterisk, knock. Knock. Knock, asterisk. It wasn't like the pounding from before. This was deliberate, measured, almost polite. But there was no way she was opening that door, not after what she had just seen. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Her hand tightened around the key as she crept toward the peephole, her heart hammering in her chest. She pressed her eye to the glass and froze. There was no one there. The knocking stopped, leaving behind a silence so heavy that Olivia felt her ears ring. She stepped back from the door, clutching the key so tightly it dug into her palm. Her breathing was shallow, every exhale laced with the fear that something or someone was waiting just outside. She considered calling the police, but what would she say? That her house seemed to be alive? That something not human had spoken to her in the attic? They'd think she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had. Her phone sat on the counter, its screen dim. Reaching for it felt like admitting she couldn't handle this alone, but before she could decide, the phone buzzed to life. The vibration startled her so much she nearly dropped the key. The screen lit up, showing an incoming call from an unknown number. She stared at it, paralyzed, as the phone vibrated relentlessly in her hand. Something deep in her gut told her not to answer, but as the call continued, her thumb moved almost involuntarily to the screen. She answered. "Hello?" Her voice was barely a whisper. At first there was nothing. Just a static hum like an old radio tuned to a dead station. Then, cutting through the white noise, came a voice. Olivia. Her knees buckled and she braced herself against the counter. It wasn't just any voice. It was her mother's. But her mother had been dead for 5 years. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The voice didn't answer. Instead, it began to hum, a tune Olivia hadn't heard since childhood. It was the lullaby her mother used to sing, the one that always made her feel safe. But now, in this context, it was anything but comforting. The hum grew louder, distorted, until it became a deafening roar that made Olivia drop the phone. It clattered to the floor, the screen shattering, but the sound didn't stop. It seemed to come from everywhere, reverberating through the walls, the floor, her very bones. She covered her ears and screamed, but her own voice was drowned out by the noise. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was more jarring than the sound. Olivia lowered her hands cautiously, her ears still ringing. The phone was dark now, its screen dead and unresponsive. But when she picked it up, she saw something chilling. The shattered glass was smeared with words, etched as if by an invisible hand. It's time. Her stomach twisted. Time for what? The key in her other hand seemed to grow heavier, almost pulling her toward the hallway. She didn't want to go, but it was as if her body had already decided for her. Her feet moved of their own accord, taking her to a door she hadn't opened since moving in, the basement. She stared at it, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. The key seemed to vibrate in her hand, urging her to unlock the door. Her fingers trembled as she slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. The air that wafted up was damp and cold, carrying with it a faint metallic scent that made her gag. She hesitated, but the same invisible force that had guided her this far pushed her forward. Step by step, she descended, her hand trailing along the rough, crumbling wall for balance. The darkness seemed alive, pressing in on her from all sides. She reached the bottom and found herself in a small, windowless room. In the center was a table, and on the table was the box. It looked exactly as it had before, except now it was open. Inside was something new, a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. She reached for it with trembling hands, her fingers brushing against the cover. The moment she touched it, the room changed. The walls seemed to stretch and ripple, and the faint metallic scent grew stronger, almost overwhelming. She opened the journal, its pages filled with cramped, chaotic handwriting. The entries were fragmented, but one word appeared over and over again. Sacrifice. The journal belonged to someone named Eleanor, who described the house as a trap, a living entity that fed on fear and despair. Eleanor wrote of her own descent into madness, how the house had lured her in, promised her freedom in exchange for obedience, and then taken everything from her. The final entry was scrawled so violently that the pen had torn through the paper in places. It needs blood. If you're reading this, it's already too late. Olivia slammed the journal shut, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She turned to leave, but the doorway was gone. In its place was a solid wall, smooth and featureless. Panic set in. She pounded on the wall, screaming for help, but the room absorbed the sound, leaving her cries muted and hollow. Then she felt it, that cold, suffocating presence, back and stronger than ever. She spun around, and there it was. The figure from the attic, its void-like face somehow more menacing in the cramped, suffocating space. "You can't leave," it said, its voice like nails scraping against glass. "You belong to us now." The walls began to close in, the room shrinking around her. The figure reached out, its spindly fingers curling toward her. "No," she screamed, clutching the journal like a shield. "I'm not yours." For a moment, the figure hesitated, its form flickering like a dying light. Olivia didn't understand why, but she felt a surge of defiance. She opened the journal again, her eyes scanning the pages for something, anything, that could help her. And then she saw it, a diagram, crude but unmistakable, showing a hidden passage beneath the table. She dropped to her knees, feeling along the floor until her fingers found a small latch. She pulled it open, revealing a narrow tunnel. Without thinking, she dove in, crawling as fast as she could as the walls behind her groaned and cracked, the figure's voice echoing in her ears. "You can't escape." The tunnel seemed endless, but eventually she saw a faint light ahead. She crawled toward it, her lungs burning and her body trembling. When she emerged, she found herself outside, the cold night air biting against her skin. The house loomed behind her, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. But she knew better. The key was still in her hand and the journal was tucked under her arm. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Not even close. The night was bitterly cold, but Olivia didn't feel it. Her skin was numb, her breath visible in short, ragged bursts as she stumbled into the overgrown yard. The house loomed behind her, its windows dark and empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her. The journal trembled in her hands, its leather cover slick with her sweat. She wanted to throw it as far as she could, to rid herself of the thing entirely. But something told her she couldn't. Whatever force had compelled her to keep it was still there, like an invisible tether pulling her back toward the unknown. Ahead, the woods stretched endlessly, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The faint outline of a dirt path wound through the trees, illuminated only by the weak moonlight. She had no idea where it led, but staying here wasn't an option. She glanced down at the key, its cold metal biting into her palm. It felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried the weight of something unseen. The journal, the key, they were connected. She didn't know how, but she was certain of it. Asterisk, you can't escape. Asterisk. The memory of the figure's voice echoed in her mind, making her shiver. She tightened her grip on the key and started down the path, her footsteps crunching against the frozen ground. The woods were eerily silent, the usual sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls absent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. She kept moving, her eyes darting to every shadow, every shifting branch. After what felt like hours, she came to a clearing. In the center stood an old well, its stones worn smooth by time. The wooden cover was broken, and the rope that once held a bucket dangled limply into the darkness below. Olivia approached cautiously, her heart pounding. Something about the well felt wrong, though she couldn't explain why. The air around it was colder, and the ground seemed to vibrate faintly beneath her feet. The journal slipped from her grasp, landing open on the ground. The pages fluttered in the breeze, stopping on a diagram that looked familiar. Her breath caught as she realized what it was: a map. The well was marked with a red X, surrounded by symbols she didn't recognize. Beside the drawing, scrawled in uneven handwriting, was a single word: asterisk, begin. Asterisk. Her stomach churned. Begin what? As if in response to her unspoken question, the key grew warm in her hand. She looked down at it, the metal now glowing faintly in the darkness. Her instinct screamed at her to turn back, to leave the journal and the key and run as far as she could. But she couldn't. She knelt by the well, peering into its depths. The darkness inside was impenetrable, but a faint sound drifted up from below, a low, rhythmic thumping like the beating of a massive heart. She swallowed hard and looked back at the journal. The word begin seemed to mock her, daring her to take the next step. She didn't know what was down there, but she had a sinking feeling that the only way to end this nightmare was to find out. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the rope. It was frayed and damp, but it held her weight as she lowered herself into the well. The air grew colder with every inch she descended, the faint heartbeat growing louder. By the time her feet touched the bottom, the sound was deafening, echoing off the slimy stone walls. She looked around, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The space was cramped, the floor covered in a thin layer of water that soaked through her shoes. In the center of the chamber was a stone altar, its surface etched with the same symbols from the journal. On the altar lay a small wooden box, identical to the one she had found in the attic. Her chest tightened. She didn't want to open it, but she knew she had to. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. Inside was a single photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a woman standing in front of the house, her face obscured by shadows. In her hand, she held the same key Olivia now carried. Written on the back of the photo were the words, asterisk she failed. Will you? Asterisk. A wave of nausea swept over her and she dropped the photo back into the box. The heartbeat grew louder, more insistent, as if demanding an answer. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise. I won't fail. The words felt hollow, but she had no choice but to believe them. She turned back to the journal, flipping through its pages in search of answers. But the text had changed. The entries were now written in her own handwriting. Her stomach dropped as she read the words. Asterisk, I found the well. I found the box. And now I must choose. Asterisk. She slammed the journal shut, her pulse racing. What choice? What did it want from her? As if in response, the walls of the well began to tremble, dust and pebbles raining down from above. The water around her feet rippled, dark shapes swirling beneath its surface. And then the voice returned. Olivia. It was closer now, surrounding her, filling the chamber with its chilling presence. The figure emerged from the shadows, its blank face tilting as it regarded her. You've come far, it said, its voice reverberating in her skull. But you are not ready. I don't understand, she said, her voice trembling. What do you want from me? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it pointed to the box. Asterisk choose. Asterisk. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the box, her mind racing. What was she supposed to do? What choice was she being asked to make? But then a memory surfaced, her mother's voice, soft and reassuring. Asterisk, sometimes, the only way out is through. Asterisk. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Olivia reached into the box and pulled out the photo. The heartbeat stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. And then the world went black. Darkness swallowed Olivia whole. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was an all-encompassing void pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. For a moment she thought she might have died. But then her senses returned, slowly, like fragments of a shattered mirror piecing themselves back together. She became aware of the cold, damp ground beneath her, the faint metallic taste in her mouth, and the sound of her own ragged breathing. She opened her eyes, or at least she thought she did. There was still nothing but blackness, endless and oppressive. And then, faintly, a light appeared in the distance. It was weak, flickering like a dying candle, but it was enough to give her direction. She forced herself to her feet, every muscle in her body screaming in protest, and began to move toward it. Each step felt like wading through quicksand. The air around her was thick, heavy with an energy that seemed to resist her every movement. But she kept going, her focus fixed on the flickering light. As she drew closer, the light grew stronger, illuminating her surroundings. She was in a tunnel, the walls made of rough, uneven stone that glistened with moisture. The air was damp and carried a faint, acrid smell that burned her nose. The tunnel led to a chamber, its walls covered in strange, pulsating veins that glowed faintly with an eerie red light. At the center of the chamber stood a massive door, carved from black stone and covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when she looked at them. The key in her hand began to vibrate, growing warmer with each step she took toward the door. She hesitated, her heart pounding. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run as far away as she could. But where would she go? This was it. She knew it in her bones. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward and pressed the key into the lock. It slid in smoothly, the metal fitting perfectly into place. For a moment, nothing happened. And then the door began to open. A rush of cold air hit her, carrying with it a sound that made her blood run cold, a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from deep within the earth. She took a step back, her eyes wide as the door swung open to reveal another chamber. This one was vast, its ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness. The floor was covered in a thick layer of ash, and at the center of the room was a circle of stones, each one carved with the same shifting symbols as the door. Inside the circle was a figure. It was a man, or at least it had been. His body was emaciated, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. He was kneeling, his head bowed, and his hands chained to the ground by thick, blackened metal. As Olivia stepped closer, the man lifted his head. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt, but there was something disturbingly familiar about him. Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer at first. He simply stared at her, his lips trembling as if trying to form words. Finally he spoke, his voice hoarse and broken. "You shouldn't have come here." Her stomach twisted. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "I was brought here. The house." "The house is a lie," he interrupted, his voice rising in desperation. "It's a trap, a lure. It feeds on us, on our fear, our pain. And now it's claimed you?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "I can stop this. I can." "You can't stop it," he shouted, the sound echoing off the walls. "It's too late. It always has been." Before she could respond, the ground beneath her feet began to shake. The stones in the circle started to glow, their light growing brighter and brighter until it was blinding. The man screamed, his voice raw with agony, as the chains around his wrists and ankles began to tighten, pulling him downward. The ash swirled around him, forming a vortex that swallowed him whole. "Wait!" Olivia cried, reaching out, but it was too late. The man was gone, and the chamber was silent once more. She stood there, trembling as the glow from the stones faded. The only sound was her own heartbeat, pounding in her ears. And then a voice spoke, low and guttural, from the darkness. "He was the last. Now it's your turn." She spun around, her eyes darting wildly, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice echoing. The ground beneath her feet began to shift, the ash swirling and coalescing into shapes, faces twisted and contorted in pain. They stared up at her, their mouths moving soundlessly. "Choose," the voice said again. The ash solidified, forming two objects at her feet, the key and the journal. She stared at them, her mind racing. The key had brought her here, but the journal held the answers, or so she thought. She didn't know what would happen if she chose one over the other, but she had a sinking feeling that neither option would end well. "Choose," the voice demanded, louder this time. Her hands trembled as she reached down. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the key, then the journal. Finally she made her choice. The moment her fingers closed around the object, the chamber exploded with light. The force of it knocked her backward, and she hit the ground hard, her head spinning. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the house. The living room was exactly as she had left it, the fire crackling in the hearth, the smell of pine in the air. For a moment she thought it might all have been a dream, but then she looked down at her hand. The object she had chosen was still there, and she knew deep down that the nightmare was far from over. Olivia's return to the house wasn't a relief. It felt like being thrown back into the jaws of the beast. The air inside was heavier now, as though the house itself had been holding its breath while she was gone, and now that she had returned, it exhaled with malevolent anticipation. She clutched the object in her hand, a thin, bone-white dagger that felt unnervingly warm to the touch. It wasn't what she expected. It wasn't the key or the journal, but something new, something unmentioned, and it pulsed faintly in her grip as though alive. The fireplace crackled in the corner, the sound sharp and irregular. The flames seemed to dance higher, casting distorted shadows across the walls. Olivia tried to steady her breathing, but the room felt alive with tension. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice shaky. No answer came. Only the creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet as she moved toward the center of the room. She placed the dagger on the coffee table and stared at it, her mind racing. The journal sat where she had left it, the pages fluttering as though moved by an invisible wind. Her eyes caught on the writing that seemed to scrawl itself across the page as she watched. Asterisk, "The blade binds you. Blood seals your fate." Asterisk. A chill ran down her spine. She grabbed the journal and flipped through the pages, but the text was changing before her eyes, erasing itself and reappearing, as though mocking her attempts to understand. She slammed it shut. "What do you want from me?" she shouted into the emptiness. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. But then the sound shifted, becoming louder, deeper, like the chime of a great bell reverberating through the house. Her head snapped toward the source, but the clock's face was blank, the hands missing. The sound wasn't coming from the clock at all. It was coming from upstairs. Olivia froze, her mind flashing back to the attic. She had sworn never to go back up there, but the sound was insistent, each chime resonating deep in her chest. It was calling her. She picked up the dagger, its weight grounding her as she made her way toward the staircase. The steps groaned beneath her, each one feeling like a test of her resolve. The upstairs hallway was darker than before, the shadows thicker, almost tangible. The sound grew louder as she approached the attic door, which stood slightly ajar as though inviting her in. Her hand trembled as she pushed it open. The attic was no longer the cluttered, dusty space she remembered. It had transformed into something entirely otherworldly. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces warped and rippling like water. The floor was a mosaic of black and white tiles, each one inscribed with a symbol that seemed to pulse faintly with light. In the center of the room stood a figure. It wasn't the faceless being she had encountered before. This one had a face, a woman's face, beautiful but unnerving in its perfection. Her skin was pale, her eyes a piercing blue that seemed to see straight through Olivia. She wore a long, flowing gown that shimmered like liquid silver, and her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "You've come far," the woman said, her voice soft but commanding. "Who are you?" Olivia asked, clutching the dagger tightly. "I am the keeper," the woman replied. "The guardian of the blade you now hold. What does it mean? Why is this happening to me?" The keeper's smile widened. "You are the chosen, Olivia. The one who must decide." "Decide what?" "To end it," the keeper said, gesturing toward the mirrors. "Or to let it continue?" Olivia's eyes darted to the mirrors, and what she saw made her stomach drop. Each one reflected a different version of herself, some older, some younger, some barely recognizable. In one she was laughing, carefree. In another she was crying, her face streaked with blood. But the one that caught her attention was directly across from her. In it, she stood holding the dagger, her face pale and drawn, her eyes empty. "What is this?" she whispered. "These are your fates," the keeper said. "Each path you might take, each life you might live. The blade chooses one, but you must wield it." Olivia shook her head, backing away. "No, I don't want this. I didn't ask for this." "None of us do," the keeper said, her voice tinged with sadness. "But the house chooses, and the house is never wrong." The mirrors began to ripple, the images distorting as though struggling to break free. The room grew colder, the air thick with an energy that made Olivia's skin prickle. "Make your choice," the keeper said, her tone firm. Olivia looked down at the dagger, its surface now glowing faintly. Her mind raced, the weight of the decision crushing her. She didn't know what would happen if she chose wrong, or if there even was a right choice. The mirrors began to crack, the sound sharp and jarring. The keeper stepped back, her expression unreadable. "Choose," she repeated, her voice echoing. Olivia raised the dagger, her hand trembling. The mirrors shattered all at once, the sound deafening. She screamed, the force of the explosion knocking her to the ground. When she opened her eyes, the attic was gone. She was standing in the woods, the dagger still in her hand. The trees were dead and gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky. The ground was covered in ash, and the air smelled of decay. Ahead of her was the well. It looked different now, larger, darker, its edges lined with the same symbols that had been in the attic. The sound of the heartbeat returned, louder than ever, pounding in her chest like a war drum. The voice came again, low and guttural. "Finish it." Olivia stared at the well, her grip tightening on the dagger. She didn't know what lay at the bottom, but she knew she couldn't turn back. With a deep breath, she stepped forward and plunged the dagger into the earth. The ground split open, the well swallowing her whole. Olivia fell. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It wasn't just the pull of gravity, it was as though the world itself was unraveling around her. Shadows coiled and twisted in her periphery, shapes forming and dissolving in an instant. She couldn't tell how far she had fallen or how much time had passed. And then, as abruptly as it had started, the descent stopped. She landed on solid ground, the impact jarring but not painful. The air around her was thick and humid, carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of her throat. She pushed herself to her feet, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She was in a cavern, its walls glistening with a strange, oily substance that reflected faint, pulsating light. The ground beneath her was uneven, littered with shards of what looked like obsidian. The dagger was still in her hand, its glow now steady and intense. Ahead of her, the cavern opened into a vast chamber. At its center stood a massive, ancient tree, its bark blackened and gnarled, its branches bare. The roots sprawled out like veins, twisting and coiling across the floor. But it was what hung from the branches that made Olivia's stomach churn. Bodies. dozens of them suspended by thick, sinewy vines that wrapped around their torsos and limbs. Their faces were pale, their eyes open and staring blankly ahead. A soft, rhythmic sound filled the air, like the whisper of leaves in the wind. But there was no wind, no life in this place. Olivia took a cautious step forward, her breath catching as one of the bodies moved. Its head turned, the motion slow and unnatural, and its eyes locked onto hers. "Help us," it whispered, its voice barely audible. She stumbled back, the dagger clattering to the ground. The other bodies began to move, their heads turning in unison to face her. "Help us," they whispered again, the sound growing louder, more insistent. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But her legs refused to move. She was rooted in place, paralyzed by a mix of fear and fascination. The whispers grew into a cacophony, the voices overlapping, their pleas becoming more desperate. "Save us. Don't leave us. You can end this." And then, a new voice cut through the noise, a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "She can't save you." The voices fell silent. The chamber was suddenly, oppressively quiet. Olivia turned, her heart pounding, and saw him. He was tall, his figure shrouded in a cloak of shadows that seemed to writhe and twist as though alive. His face was obscured, but his eyes burned like twin embers, piercing and unrelenting. "You," Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, his movements fluid and deliberate. "You've come far," he said, his voice low and even. "But this is where it ends." "What do you mean?" she asked, clutching the dagger tightly. "This tree," he said, gesturing to the grotesque centerpiece of the chamber, "is the heart of the house. It is the source of its power, its hunger. And it has chosen you." "Chosen me for what?" "To be its guardian," he said. "To take my place." Her blood ran cold. "No, I didn't agree to this. I didn't." "You did," he interrupted. "The moment you entered the house. The moment you took the key. The house is alive, Olivia. It sees, it chooses, and it binds. There is no escape." She shook her head, backing away. "I won't do it. I won't." "You have no choice," he said, his tone final. "You can either take your place willingly, or the tree will take you by force." The roots began to move, slithering across the ground like snakes. Olivia's breath hitched as one wrapped around her ankle, its grip cold and unyielding. She slashed at it with the dagger, the blade slicing cleanly through the root, which recoiled with a hiss. The figure tilted his head as though amused. "You think that will save you?" he asked. "The dagger is not your salvation. It is your curse." She looked down at the blade, its glow now pulsating, almost frantic. "You can't fight the house," he continued, "but you can make it yours. Take the tree's power. Bind it to your will." "And what happens to you?" she asked, her voice tight. "I am freed," he said simply. The roots lunged at her again and she dodged, her movements frantic. She didn't know what to do, didn't know who to trust. The house had twisted everything, blurred the lines between truth and deception. "Choose, Olivia," the figure said, his voice rising. "Take the power or let it consume you." The whispers returned, the bodies on the tree writhing as though in agony. "Save us," they pleaded. The roots coiled tighter, and Olivia felt herself being dragged toward the tree. She screamed, slashing wildly with the dagger, but it was no use. The tree's bark split open, revealing a hollow core that pulsed with a sickly red light. "Choose," the figure roared. In a desperate act, Olivia plunged the dagger into the ground, the blade sinking deep into the earth. The chamber erupted with light and sound, the ground shaking violently. The roots released her and she stumbled back, shielding her eyes. When the light faded, the tree was gone. The chamber was empty, silent, and the figure was nowhere to be seen. She was alone. The dagger lay at her feet, its glow now faint, almost extinguished. She picked it up, her hands trembling. A voice echoed in her mind, soft and familiar. "It's not over." The ground beneath her began to shift again, the obsidian shards rearranging themselves into a spiral pattern. A new path opened before her, leading deeper into the darkness. She took a step forward, her grip tightening on the dagger. She didn't know where it led, but she knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back. The spiral pathway seemed endless, winding deeper and deeper into the bowels of the earth. The walls around Olivia pulsed with a dull red glow, like veins feeding some monstrous heart. Her breathing echoed in the narrow passageway, each step reverberating in the oppressive silence. She didn't know how much time had passed, or if time even mattered here. The dagger in her hand felt heavier, its faint glow flickering as though struggling to stay alive. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, the shadows shifting just out of sight. Ahead, the path opened into a massive cavern, its ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness. At the center stood a towering monolith, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift as she stared. Surrounding the monolith were figures, dozens of them shrouded in black, their heads bowed as if in prayer. Olivia froze, her heart pounding. She didn't know if they were alive or some twisted creations of the house, but she wasn't eager to find out. As she stepped closer, the figures began to move, their heads turning toward her in unison. Their faces were featureless, smooth and pale like porcelain masks. One of them stepped forward, its movements unnaturally fluid. "You've come," it said, its voice a hollow echo that sent chills down her spine. "I didn't have much of a choice," Olivia said, her voice trembling. The figure tilted its head as though studying her. "The house chose you for a reason. Do you not feel it? The pull? The connection?" "I feel like I've been dragged into a nightmare I can't wake up from," she said, gripping the dagger tightly. The figure raised a hand and the others began to chant, their voices low and guttural, filling the cavern with a sound that seemed to vibrate in her bones. The monolith began to glow, the symbols on its surface pulsing in time with the chanting. "This is your destiny," the figure said. "To become one with the house. To wield its power." "I don't want its power," Olivia said, stepping back. The chanting grew louder, the light from the monolith intensifying. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, cracks spiderwebbing out from the base of the monolith. "You don't have a choice," the figure said. "The house has chosen you. You cannot defy it." Olivia's mind raced. She didn't know what to do, but every instinct screamed at her to run. She turned, but the path she had come from was gone, replaced by a wall of pulsating black stone. "You can't escape," the figure said, its voice calm but menacing. The other figures began to move toward her, their featureless faces tilting as if mocking her fear. Desperation took hold. Olivia raised the dagger, its glow suddenly flaring to life. The figures halted, their heads snapping toward the blade. "You think that will save you?" the figure said, its tone almost amused. "I don't know," Olivia said, "but I'm not going down without a fight." She lunged, slashing at the nearest figure. The blade passed through it like smoke, the figure dissolving and reforming in an instant. The others closed in, their movements slow but deliberate, as though savoring her fear. She backed up against the wall, the dagger's glow flickering wildly. The chanting grew deafening, the cavern shaking violently as the monolith began to crack. And then a voice echoed through the cavern, a voice she recognized. "Olivia." She froze, her eyes darting around the room. It was faint, almost drowned out by the chanting, but it was unmistakable. It was her mother's voice. "Olivia, you have to listen to me." "No," Olivia whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. You're not real." "I'm here," the voice said, closer now. "I've always been here. You just didn't see me." The monolith shattered, the pieces flying outward and stopping midair, suspended as if caught in a web. The chanting ceased, the figures freezing in place. The voice came again, louder, clearer. "Trust the blade. It's the only way." Olivia looked down at the dagger, its glow steady and strong. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew she had no other option. She stepped forward, toward the center of the cavern, the figures parting as she moved. The pieces of the monolith hovered around her, their surfaces still glowing faintly. At the center of where the monolith had stood was a pedestal, its surface inscribed with the same shifting symbols. The voice spoke again. "Place the blade." And this. Olivia hesitated. She didn't know what would happen if she obeyed, or if she could trust the voice. But the weight of the dagger in her hand was undeniable, as though urging her forward. She placed the dagger on the pedestal. The cavern erupted with light, the force knocking her to the ground. The figures disintegrated, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke that were pulled into the pedestal. The shards of the monolith were drawn together, reforming into a new shape, a small, intricate box that pulsed with a faint red glow. The voice spoke one last time. "You've done it, Olivia. But the price has yet to be paid." The ground beneath her began to crack, the cavern collapsing around her. She grabbed the box and ran, her heart pounding as the walls caved in behind her. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay. The path led her back to the surface, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. She stumbled out of the house, the box clutched tightly in her hands. The house groaned, its walls buckling and collapsing inward. She stood there, watching as the house consumed itself, until there was nothing left but silence. Olivia looked down at the box, its surface smooth and cold. She didn't know what she had unleashed, but she knew one thing for certain. The nightmare was far from over. The box felt alive in Olivia's hands, its surface cold yet pulsating faintly like a heartbeat. Standing outside the now obliterated house, she tried to steady her breathing, but her thoughts raced like a storm. What had she done? What was the price the voice had mentioned? And why did the box seem heavier with each passing moment, as though absorbing her fear and uncertainty? The world around her was eerily still. The night sky stretched endlessly above, but the stars seemed dimmer, as if recoiling from the events that had just transpired. Olivia's gaze returned to the box, its faint red glow a persistent reminder of the chaos she had unleashed. She was about to place it down, to abandon it in the desolate field where the house had once stood, when a low hum filled the air. It was subtle at first, like the distant buzz of a beehive, but it grew louder, sharper, and more invasive. Olivia spun around, her pulse quickening. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the ground, converging toward her like creeping tendrils. And then she saw them. Figures emerging from the darkness, their movements disjointed, as though their limbs were not their own. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the same crimson light as the box. These weren't the faceless beings from the cavern, they were something far worse. They were familiar. The first figure to step into the faint moonlight was her mother, or at least what remained of her. Her once kind eyes were now voids of red, her expression blank yet horrifyingly focused on Olivia. "Mom?" Olivia whispered, taking a hesitant step back. More figures followed. Her father, her childhood best friend, her old teacher from middle school. Each face was a grotesque mockery of the people she had loved and lost. "You shouldn't have taken it," her mother said, her voice layered with an unnatural distortion. Olivia stumbled backward, clutching the box tighter. "You're not real. This isn't real." The figures moved closer, their steps synchronized and deliberate. "You've bound yourself to it," her father said, his voice hollow. "And now it binds itself to you? What does that mean?" Olivia cried, tears streaming down her face. "It means you can't run," her best friend said, a sinister smile stretching across her otherwise lifeless face. "You are part of it now." Olivia's mind screamed for her to flee, but her legs felt like lead. The box in her hands grew colder, the glow intensifying as if feeding off her fear. One of the figures lunged and instinct took over. Olivia turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she sprinted across the barren field. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, shifting and crumbling with each step. The figures followed, their movements impossibly fast despite their unnatural gait. "You can't escape," her mother's voice echoed, distorted and inhuman. The field stretched endlessly before her, the landscape twisting and warping. The stars above seemed to flicker, their faint light struggling against the encroaching darkness. She stumbled, nearly falling as the box pulsed violently in her hands. Its glow illuminated the path ahead, revealing a dense forest that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Without thinking, Olivia darted into the trees, the branches clawing at her skin as she pushed forward. The air was thick, making it harder to breathe, and the forest floor was littered with roots that seemed to reach for her ankles. The figures didn't stop. Their glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, their distorted voices calling out to her, each word laced with malice. "Give it back, Olivia. You can't keep running. It's already too late." The forest seemed alive, the trees swaying despite the absence of wind. The whispers began again, weaving through the air like a sinister melody. "You were chosen. You belong to us. Let it consume you." Olivia clutched the box tighter, her mind racing. She couldn't give in, not after everything she had endured. There had to be a way to stop this, to end the nightmare once and for all. As she pushed deeper into the forest, a faint light appeared in the distance. It wasn't the harsh, crimson glow of the box. It was soft, golden, and warm. Hope sparked within her, and she sprinted toward it, ignoring the branches tearing at her clothes and skin. The light led her to a clearing where an ancient, crumbling altar stood at its center. Symbols identical to those on the box were etched into the stone, their grooves filled with a faintly glowing liquid. Olivia hesitated, her heart pounding. The altar seemed both inviting and foreboding, as though it held the answers she sought but demanded a price she wasn't prepared to pay. The whispers grew louder, the forest alive with voices that weren't her own. Place it here. End the cycle. Or let it consume everything. The figures burst into the clearing, their glowing eyes locking onto her. They moved as one, closing in with terrifying precision. Olivia didn't have time to think. She placed the box on the altar, its glow intensifying as the symbols on the stone flared to life. The ground shook and a deafening roar filled the air. The figures stopped, their movements jerky and disjointed as though something was pulling at them. The box cracked, light spilling from its seams as the whispers reached a fever pitch. And then, silence. The figures dissolved into smoke, their forms dissipating into the air. The box shattered, its pieces disintegrating into dust that was carried away by an unseen wind. Olivia collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. The forest was quiet, the oppressive darkness lifted. But as she looked around, she realized she was still alone. The altar was gone, the clearing empty. The soft golden light had vanished, leaving her in the dim glow of the moonlight. She didn't know if she had won or simply delayed the inevitable. But one thing was certain. The house, the box, the horrors, they had marked her. And the nightmare wasn't over. Olivia woke to the sound of her own frantic breathing. Her eyes shot open, her heart hammering in her chest. The dream, or nightmare, was still fresh in her mind, each twisted image and agonizing voice burned into her thoughts. She wasn't in the forest anymore, she wasn't standing in front of the altar. Her surroundings were unfamiliar, but they felt eerily close. The air was thick with dust and stale, cold moisture, and the room was dimly lit by a single flickering light above. It was a basement. The walls were made of stone, weathered and crumbling, their surfaces covered in dark stains. The floor beneath her was cold and uneven, as though the building itself had been abandoned for years. She pushed herself up, her limbs stiff, and instinctively reached for the box. But it was gone. Her breath caught in her throat. The box. She had placed it on the altar, she had seen it shatter, crumble into dust. But now, there was nothing. "Where am I?" she whispered aloud, her voice breaking the silence. Her eyes scanned the room, darting from the cracked wooden shelves to the cobweb-covered corners. There were no windows, no doors, just a small, rotting cot in the corner and piles of forgotten junk scattered around her. The basement was suffocatingly quiet, as though the world outside had ceased to exist. She stood up, steadying herself as the room spun briefly. Her head was aching, a sharp throb pulsing through her temples. She didn't know how she got here, but she had no time to waste. She needed answers. She needed to find out what was happening. Taking a deep breath, she crossed the room and approached the staircase leading upward. Her every step was deliberate, the weight of her past actions pressing down on her shoulders. She could feel it, the strange pull, the subtle hum in the air, as though something unseen was drawing her closer to an unknown fate. Her hand rested on the doorknob, cold and smooth, and she hesitated for a brief moment. She didn't want to open it, didn't want to face whatever lay beyond. But she knew that running was no longer an option. With a swift motion, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The hallway on the other side was dark, with only a faint glow coming from under a door at the far end. The house, or whatever this place was, felt wrong. It was like stepping into a place that wasn't meant to exist, a space between the world of the living and something far darker. She walked down the hall, the floor creaking under her feet with each step. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft whisper of her breath and the occasional squeak of the floorboards. The air was thick with a sense of decay, the walls around her seemingly closing in with every passing second. When she reached the door at the end of the hall, she hesitated for only a second before pushing it open. The room inside was ordinary. Too ordinary. There was a bed in the center, a desk piled high with papers, a chair facing the window. It could have been any bedroom except for one thing, the walls. They were covered in symbols. The same symbols she had seen in the cavern. The same symbols that had glowed faintly when the box was still intact. Her hands trembled as she stepped further into the room, her eyes scanning the walls, the faint glow from the symbols casting eerie shadows. The floor was littered with remnants of old books and broken objects, like someone had been frantically searching for something. And then she saw it. On the desk, partially obscured by a pile of torn paper, was a journal. It was old, the leather cover cracked and weathered as though it had been there for centuries. Her heart skipped a beat as she reached for it, her fingers grazing the surface of the journal. There was no turning back now. Opening the journal, she flipped through the pages, each one filled with hastily scribbled notes and diagrams. Some of the writing was barely legible, but one thing was clear. Whoever had written this had been preparing for something. Her eyes locked on a page that was different from the rest. It was filled with the same symbols, but in the center there was a drawing. A circle with lines connecting various points, lines that mirrored the path she had taken through the house. At the center of the circle was a word written in bold, trembling letters. Resonance. Olivia's fingers trembled as she read the word. There was something about it, something familiar and chilling. And then it clicked. Resonance. The pull. The connection. The house. She had been marked. She had always been marked. The journal continued, describing rituals, incantations, and warnings. It spoke of an ancient force that had been imprisoned long ago, something tied to the house, to the very land it sat upon. It mentioned a key, an artifact that had the power to either seal the force away or release it entirely. The box. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. The box wasn't just a vessel, it was the key. But it was shattered, destroyed. She slammed the journal shut, panic rising in her chest. If the box had been the key, then what would happen now that it was gone? Was the force already free? Had she unleashed it the moment she placed the box on the altar? She didn't know, but one thing was certain. She had to find a way to fix it. As she turned to leave, a cold wind swept through the room, slamming the door shut behind her. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, their faint light now a burning red. And then she heard the voice. Olivia, you cannot escape what you've started. It wasn't a whisper. It was a command, a voice that echoed deep within her skull. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The house groaned, its foundations shaking as though something vast and powerful was waking within. Olivia ran. She didn't know where she was going, but the house was alive now, alive with a hunger that could no longer be ignored. The walls around her seemed to close in, the air thick with something far darker than fear. The house wanted her. It had always wanted her. And now it was about to claim her. Olivia's heart raced in her chest, her footsteps frantic as she ran through the hallway, her mind spinning. The voice, deep and resonant, still echoed in her head, the words like nails scratching at her thoughts. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape them. Whatever had been set into motion couldn't be undone. The house felt like a labyrinth now. Each turn led her deeper into a place she didn't understand, into something far darker than the nightmare she had once feared. The walls seemed to shift, distorting the familiar rooms into places of suffocating darkness. The air felt heavy, thick with a presence that pressed down on her with every step. She reached the staircase, nearly tripping over the uneven steps as she hurried upward, but when she reached the top, she froze. The door at the end of the hall was wide open. It wasn't supposed to be open. This was the same hallway where she had started her search. The same door she had passed through when she had first entered this cursed place. But now it was wide open, beckoning her forward with an unnatural pull, as though the house itself were calling her. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to find another way, but something deeper inside her urged her forward. The voice, its voice, was louder now, more urgent, more insistent. Come to me, Olivia. She didn't know why, but her feet moved, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, drawn to the open door like a moth to a flame. When she crossed the threshold, the room inside was empty, except for the mirror. The mirror. She hadn't noticed it before, but now it was impossible to ignore. It was enormous, covering the entire wall opposite the door. The glass was dark, almost black, as though it had been untouched by time, yet it reflected the dim light from the hallway in an eerie, distorted way. The longer Olivia stared at it, the more the reflection began to change. At first, it was her own face, her tired eyes, her pale skin, but then a figure emerged behind her in the mirror. It was her, but it wasn't. The reflection in the glass twisted, pulling itself apart as though it were struggling to escape the confines of the mirror. Olivia's heart hammered in her chest, and she stumbled backward, almost falling over as the figure in the reflection started to move on its own. The figure in the mirror smiled, a smile that was not hers. The eyes, they weren't hers either. They were dark, black as coal, their pupils dilated, as if the person in the mirror wasn't even human anymore. No, no, no. Olivia gasped, her breath shallow. She turned away from the mirror, desperate to break its hold, but the figure in the reflection didn't stop. It began to mimic her, its every move a twisted version of her own. It lifted its hands slowly, deliberately, reaching toward her, its lips pulling back into a wide, unnatural grin. "You are already here," it whispered, its voice not a sound but a pulse in her mind. Olivia's entire body trembled with terror. She couldn't look away. It was as though the mirror had a life of its own, pulling her into it, drawing her closer. She fought it, but it was like an invisible force had wrapped itself around her, and no matter how hard she tried to pull away, her body moved forward. And then the reflection stepped out of the mirror. Not through it, but from within it, as though the glass had never been solid at all. It wasn't her. It was something else, something wrong. It wore her face, but its body was distorted, elongated. Its arms were unnaturally long, its fingers gnarled like claws. Its breath was heavy, a raspy, unnatural sound that filled the room with the scent of decay. The figure's lips parted in that same hideous grin, and it whispered, "Asterisk, you called mean asterisk." Olivia screamed, stumbling backward, her feet tripping over one another. The creature, her reflection, advanced toward her, its smile widening with each step. She was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to scream. "You can never escape," the figure whispered, its voice scraping at her mind. "Asterisk, you have already been chosen." Asterisk. Olivia's chest tightened as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't comprehend what was happening. She was in the room with the thing, but it wasn't her. It was something else entirely, something other. Her hands moved by themselves, reaching toward the mirror, as though her body were no longer under her control. The closer she got, the stronger the pull became, drawing her toward the glass. "No," she gasped, shaking her head violently. "I'm not you. I'm not like you." But the figure smiled, and with a horrifyingly slow motion, it reached out, its fingers grazing her own. And the moment their hands touched, the mirror shattered. The room erupted in a deafening crash as glass exploded in every direction, scattering in a million shards, all reflecting her face twisted into that same dark smile. Olivia covered her face with her hands, backing away, but it was too late. The pieces of the mirror floated in the air, surrounding her, each one alive with a reflection of her own. "You can't escape what you've become," the voice of her reflection echoed. "Asterisk, the house owns you now." Asterisk. The glass shards began to move, circling her like vultures, each one flickering with images of the horrors she had already witnessed. The house, the box, the altar, the figures. All of them were trapped in the shards, but now they were closing in on her. Her pulse raced as her surroundings grew darker, the walls of the room beginning to close in. The pieces of glass began to hum, vibrating in the air, sending waves of pressure through the room. And then the darkness took her. When Olivia awoke, it wasn't like before. She didn't simply open her eyes and find herself in a new place, confused and disoriented. This time, it was as if she was being pulled out of a deep, dark void. She could feel the weight of something heavy, oppressive, pressing down on her chest, squeezing the breath out of her. It took a moment before she realized she wasn't lying on the cold, stone floor anymore. She was in a room. No, it wasn't a room at all. It was like being in the middle of an endless, suffocating tunnel, the walls closing in on her from all sides, their surfaces slick with moisture. The air was thick, heavy with a stale, metallic scent that made her stomach turn. The walls seemed to breathe with her, pulsing in rhythm with her heart, as though the very structure of the house had become a living thing. Her mind raced. Asterisk, where am I? What happened? Asterisk. She forced herself to sit up, her head spinning, her body weak, and as she looked around, she realized she was no longer alone. There were figures in the darkness, shadows that moved and shifted like smoke. At first, they appeared to be nothing more than vague silhouettes, but as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw them clearly, saw their faces. Their faces were a twisted mockery of human form. Eyes black as coal, hollow and empty, staring straight through her. Their mouths were stretched into grotesque smiles, but their lips didn't move. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The air was thick with an unspoken understanding. They were watching her, and they knew what she had done. She tried to back away, but her limbs felt like they were made of lead, each movement sluggish, each breath a struggle. The figures didn't move toward her. They didn't need to. It was as if they were bound to the space like a part of the very house itself. But Olivia could feel them getting closer. She could feel their eyes on her, their presence suffocating her. And then, from somewhere deeper in the shadows, she heard the voice. It was a whisper, but it carried through the space like a scream in her mind. Asterisk, you cannot hide from what you have done, asterisk. The voice wasn't like the others. It wasn't cold or lifeless. It was warm, familiar, even like a memory she couldn't quite place. No, Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean to. The shadows around her shifted, their forms moving, the air vibrating with the force of their presence. Asterisk, but you did, asterisk, the voice said, its tone dark, heavy with the weight of something ancient. Asterisk, and now, you will pay the price, asterisk. Olivia's chest tightened, her breath quickening as the figures in the room began to converge on her. The walls seemed to close in even further, and she realized that the space around her wasn't a tunnel. It was a cage meant for her. Her panic surged as the shadows stretched toward her, their hands reaching out to claim her. She scrambled backward, pushing herself up, trying to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were pressing in from all sides, the figures surrounding her, their cold eyes fixed on her every move. And then, suddenly, the voice again, this time closer. Asterisk, you will not escape, Olivia. You never could, asterisk. Her mind screamed, but her body didn't respond. The fear paralyzed her, and the figures closed in, their hands ghosting over her skin. Her skin crawled with the touch of something not quite human, but she couldn't pull away. The warmth of their presence suffocated her, and for a moment, Olivia wondered if this was it, if she had finally reached the end. But then she heard something different. A sound that didn't belong. It was a voice, human and panicked. Asterisk, Olivia. Olivia, wake up, asterisk. She turned her head, her body moving of its own accord, her mind desperately trying to make sense of the voice. A figure stepped forward from the shadows, but this one was different. It wasn't a distorted, twisted thing. It was a woman, tall, pale, with long dark hair that flowed around her like a shroud. Asterisk, Olivia, you need to wake up. You can't stay here, asterisk. The woman's voice was desperate, pleading. Olivia's vision blurred as she focused on the figure. There was something about her, something familiar, but she couldn't place it. Who are you? Olivia asked, her voice hoarse. The woman stepped closer, her face inches from Olivia's. Her eyes were wide, filled with a deep, consuming fear. Asterisk, you don't remember me? Asterisk, the woman whispered. Asterisk, it's too late for that now, Olivia. You have to get out of here before it, asterisk. But before she could finish, the shadows lunged. Olivia screamed, pushing herself back as the darkness swallowed the woman whole. She reached out, but it was too late. The shadows took her, pulling her into the depths. And Olivia was left alone once more, surrounded by nothing but the suffocating weight of the house. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she realized the truth. She wasn't just trapped in this place. She had become a part of it. The house had claimed her, and there was no escaping now. But just as the shadows began to close in once more, she heard a distant, familiar sound, a door creaking open, a rush of air, the faintest echo of something beyond the suffocating darkness. It was a way out. She didn't know how, didn't know why, but she had to reach it. She had to escape before the house took everything from her. With everything she had left, Olivia pushed forward, stumbling through the dark, her mind filled with only one thought. She had to find the door. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest, the rhythmic sound nearly drowning out the heavy silence that surrounded her. The shadows had receded for now, but she could feel them lurking, waiting for the moment she let her guard down. Every step she took was a risk. Every breath she drew felt like an invitation for the darkness to consume her once more. She didn't know how long she had been trapped in this place, but she could feel the weight of time pressing in on her. The house was alive. It had to be. There was no other explanation for the strange occurrences, the voices, the way it seemed to shift, to respond to her. She forced herself to focus, shaking off the overwhelming dread that threatened to swallow her. There had to be a way out. The door she had heard, the one she thought she had imagined, had to be real. She had to find it. Her surroundings felt like a maze. The narrow hallways twisted, the walls seeming to shift with every glance. The windows were black, sealed shut, and every door she approached was either locked or vanished before she could reach it. She turned down a hallway, the light dimming as she walked further, the air growing colder. The familiar, oppressive smell of decay clung to her, tightening her throat with each breath. And then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, almost hidden in the shadows, was a door. It wasn't like the others. There was no distortion in the air, no sense of wrongness. For a fleeting moment, it felt almost welcoming, like a path to safety. But Olivia knew better than to trust anything in this house. She had learned that the hard way. Still, she couldn't ignore the pull, the sensation that she had no choice but to walk toward it. Her legs moved, one step after another, each footfall sounding like thunder in the silence. As she reached for the handle, her hand trembling, she felt a shiver run through her spine. The door was cold to the touch, but it wasn't locked. It opened with ease, the hinges creaking in protest as if reluctant to let her pass. Beyond the door was a room. It wasn't the same as the others. It wasn't a basement or a hallway or a parlor. This room felt different. It felt old, ancient even. The walls were covered in dust, and the air was thick with the scent of something long forgotten. The room was empty save for one thing. In the center of the room, sitting atop a pedestal, was a box. A small wooden box, ornate and carved with strange symbols that twisted and turned in ways that didn't seem possible. The wood was dark, almost black, and the box seemed to hum with an energy that vibrated in the air around her. Olivia stood frozen in place. Something about the box felt wrong. It felt like it knew her, like it was calling to her. But she didn't know how, she didn't know why. With hesitant steps, she moved closer. The closer she got, the stronger the pull became, like the box was drawing her in, like it was pulling her toward it. She reached out, her hand hovering above it for a moment before she could bring herself to touch it. The moment her fingers brushed against the smooth surface, the room seemed to tremble. A low hum filled the air, and the symbols on the box began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter, until they burned with an otherworldly light. Olivia gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she jerked her hand back. But it was too late. The box had already opened. Inside there was nothing at first. Just a deep, endless void, like looking into a mirror that reflected nothing. But then, slowly, something began to emerge. A shape. A face. It was her face. Or rather, it looked like her face. It was twisted, though distorted, its features melting and reforming into something unrecognizable. The eyes were wide, wild, the pupils small and frenzied, and the mouth stretched open in a silent scream. Olivia stumbled backward, her heart racing as the figure inside the box began to move. It wasn't just a face, it was a whole body, but it wasn't human. The arms were too long, the legs too thin, and the skin was a sickly pale, stretched over bone like a thin, fragile shell. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its head cocking to the side as it fixed its gaze on her. You opened it, the voice echoed in her mind. It wasn't a voice, not really. It was more like a thought, a presence. And it wasn't hers. It was a thing, a force, a presence that had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for her. You shouldn't have come, the voice whispered again, closer this time, vibrating in her chest, crawling under her skin. The figure in the box began to rise, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it unfolded, the bones creaking, the skin pulling tight as it grew. Olivia wanted to scream, wanted to run, but her body refused to obey. You cannot leave, the voice said, colder now. You belong to it now. You belong to me, . The room seemed to close in, the walls shifting, pulsing with the same sickening energy that emanated from the box. The figure began to move toward her, its eyes locked onto hers, the grin on its face widening with every step. Olivia tried to move, tried to scream, but she couldn't. Her legs were frozen, her lungs burning as if the very air had turned to lead. Her vision blurred, the edges of her world becoming fuzzy, distorted. She could feel it, feel the thing in the box closing in on her, consuming her, taking her in. And then, just as the figure was inches away, it stopped. The air around her seemed to hold its breath. The walls were silent now, still as if waiting for something. The figure in the box tilted its head once more, its eyes narrowing as it seemed to study her. For a long moment, Olivia stood motionless, her heart pounding in her chest, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then, the figure spoke again, but this time, it wasn't the voice that had haunted her mind before. It was different. It was a voice she knew. A voice she remembered. Olivia. Her name, whispered softly but full of pain, full of grief. It was her mother's voice. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The world around her seemed to stop, as though time had lost its meaning, and all she could hear was that voice. Asterisk, help me, asterisk. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the figure. Her heart raced, and for a moment she didn't know if she was dreaming, if this was all some twisted nightmare. But it wasn't. It was real. Her mother's face was staring back at her, her features distorted, her eyes wide and pleading. She reached out, her hands trembling, desperate, but before Olivia could react, the figure jerked back, its face twisting in horror, its mouth opening wide in a silent scream. And then everything shattered. The walls of the room cracked, the air went cold, and the box slammed shut. The figure inside was gone, leaving nothing but the empty pedestal. Olivia stood there, frozen in place, trying to make sense of what had just happened. And then she heard it. A voice. But this time it wasn't her mother's. It was something else entirely. Something darker. Asterisk, you think you've escaped, Olivia? You're not freeing, asterisk. The darkness closed in again, and Olivia knew, deep down, that there was no escape. Olivia stumbled backward, her head spinning as the darkness in the room deepened. The words lingered in her mind, repeating over and over, like an echo that refused to fade. Asterisk, you think you've escaped, Olivia? You're not freeing, asterisk. The voice was everywhere, surrounding her, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating blanket. The box, asterisk, her mother's face in the box, asterisk. It was gone. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something much worse had been set into motion. The room was quiet now, unnaturally quiet. The kind of silence that spoke louder than any scream, the kind of stillness that made her skin crawl. She was no longer alone. She could feel it. It was like a presence in the air, an oppressive weight that hung over her, suffocating her with its cold, invisible touch. And in the center of the room, just beyond the pedestal where the box had been, was a doorway. Not just any doorway, but a door that she hadn't seen before, as though it had appeared out of thin air. She didn't want to go near it. Every instinct screamed at her to run the other way, to turn around and never look back. But there was something about the door, something that called to her, pulled her forward like an unseen hand. Her feet moved before she could think, each step a struggle, her legs trembling beneath her. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to thicken, the darkness seeping out from beneath the door frame, wrapping itself around her ankles, pulling her closer. Her breath hitched in her throat. She wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, something deeper, darker, that was making her move. But as her hand reached for the door, she felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't the cold of the room. It was something else. The door handle was icy to the touch, and as she gripped it, the wood seemed to groan in protest. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of everything she had been through crashing down on her, but then, with no other choice, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was unlike anything she had seen before. It was vast, far larger than the confines of the house should allow. The walls were lined with mirrors, tall and narrow, reflecting her in every direction. Her own face stared back at her from each of them, but the reflections were wrong, distorted, twisted, as if each one was trying to pull her in, trying to swallow her whole. The floor was covered in dust, but it wasn't just dust. It was something darker, something thick, sticky like old blood. Olivia's footstep left a trail as she moved forward, but the air was heavy with a sense of foreboding that made her stomach churn. The mirrors shimmered around her, the reflections flickering, shifting like they were alive. A low, guttural sound rumbled in the distance. Something was in there with her. It wasn't just the reflections. There was a presence in the room, a force that pressed in on her from all sides, pulling at her very being. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took another step, but her body refused to obey. She couldn't stop herself from moving forward. She couldn't turn back. She was drawn deeper into the room, the mirrors multiplying with each step she took, until she could no longer tell where she was, where the real her was, or which reflection was the one that mattered. The room seemed endless, the walls closing in around her, each mirror growing more distorted with every passing moment. And then she heard it. A voice. Asterisk, Olivia. Asterisk. It was soft at first, a whisper in the distance, but it was unmistakable. It was her name. She turned, frantic, searching for the source. But all she saw were the reflections. She couldn't trust them. She couldn't trust anything in this house. Asterisk, Olivia. Asterisk. This time the voice was louder. Clear. Closer. She spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, except for the mirrors reflecting her from every angle, each one showing a different version of herself. A different Olivia. But there was something else, something that made her blood run cold. In the mirrors, her reflection began to move on its own. It wasn't like before. Before, the reflections had been a twisted version of herself, but now they were becoming something else. They weren't just reflections. They were other versions of her, other Olivias, each one standing still but staring back at her with eyes that were full of malice. Their smiles were too wide, their expressions too cold. They were alive and they were reaching out to her. Her reflection in the mirror to her left smiled. No, it grinned, and for the first time Olivia realized with a horrifying certainty that these weren't just mirrors. They were windows. Windows to something darker. She tried to turn away, but the room shifted, the mirrors multiplying again, forcing her to turn in circles, her breath coming faster and faster, each reflection of herself more twisted than the last. And then something else appeared in the mirrors. A figure. A man. He was tall, cloaked in black, his face obscured by a hood, but Olivia could feel his presence, even though she couldn't see him clearly. He was the one pulling the strings, controlling the mirrors, controlling the darkness. The reflection of the man moved in a way that her own reflection couldn't. He reached out, and as his hand touched the glass, the mirrors rippled, distorting around his touch. She gasped and took a step back, but the man's hand shot forward, emerging from the mirror, grabbing her wrist with inhuman strength. The force of his grip sent a shock through her, cold and sharp, like ice coursing through her veins. Olivia tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the mirror, drowned in the cold, suffocating silence. You should have never opened the door, the man's voice rumbled, low and guttural, filling her head with his words. You think you can escape? You think you can escape from me? From it? Her vision blurred as she struggled, but the man's grip tightened, and for the first time Olivia realized the truth. The mirrors weren't just reflections. They were part of the house, part of the trap that had been set for her. Her hand flew to her throat, clawing at the air, desperate to free herself. She could feel the darkness closing in, the edges of the room warping, distorting into something unrecognizable. The man in the mirror began to pull her toward him, and she could feel herself being dragged into the glass, her body half formed, half dissolved. You belong to the house now, Olivia, the man hissed. And with that, the world around her shattered. Olivia's world spun, the sensation of falling faster and faster, as though the floor beneath her feet had disappeared entirely. Her mind screamed for clarity, for a way out, but there was no escape. She was trapped, caught in the merciless grip of the house. The mirrors, the reflections, the figure that had haunted her every step. She couldn't tell where she was anymore. Was it a room? Was it still part of the house, or had it transformed into something far worse? Her body slammed into the cold, unforgiving surface, a jarring shock that sent waves of pain through her chest. She gasped for air, her heart hammering in her throat, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The world around her was dark, so dark that she couldn't even see her own hands in front of her face. Her mind, clouded with panic, struggled to make sense of her surroundings, but the darkness swallowed everything. There was no light, no escape, and then, slowly, the darkness began to recede. At first, it was only a crack, a sliver of light cutting through the void, but the longer she stared, the bigger it became. And through that crack, she could hear it. The whispers. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves on a distant wind, but then they grew louder, sharper, more insistent. The voices twisted around her, scraping at her sanity, pulling at her thoughts. Olivia. The voice wasn't just one voice. It was hundreds, thousands, all echoing at once, speaking over each other, distorting, shifting. She could hear her name, repeated again and again, until it became a chant, a demand. Olivia, join us, She shut her eyes, clenching her fists, trying to block it out, but the voices grew louder still, crawling under her skin, burrowing deep inside her mind. You can never escape. You belong to us now, The crack of light widened, revealing a figure. A shadow at first, but as it stepped closer, she could see it more clearly. It was him. The figure that had haunted her through every room, every hallway. The man in the cloak, his face hidden by the hood, his presence suffocating, looming over her like a nightmare made flesh. He stepped forward, his feet never quite touching the ground. His movements were unnaturally smooth, fluid, like he was gliding across the floor. He reached out, his hand stretching toward her, and Olivia recoiled, but her body refused to move, as if frozen in place by an invisible force. Asterisk, you're here, Olivia, asterisk, the man's voice rumbled, his words slow, deliberate. Asterisk, you've always been here, asterisk. His fingers brushed against her cheek, cold as ice, and she felt a jolt of fear shoot through her veins. His touch was like death itself, like it was draining the warmth from her very soul. Asterisk, I warned you, asterisk, he whispered. Asterisk, you can't run from the house. You can't run from what's inside you, asterisk. The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. She tried to scream to push him away, but her body was weak, too weak to fight. The darkness continued to close in, suffocating her as the figure's form began to blur, twisting, warping. Asterisk, the house owns you now, Olivia, asterisk, he repeated, his voice growing colder with each word. Asterisk, you've opened the door. And now, you're ours, asterisk. A shiver ran down her spine, the weight of his words crushing her. She had been running, fighting to escape, but the truth was unavoidable. She had never really left. This house, asterisk, this thing, asterisk, had been inside her from the moment she first stepped foot in it. It had been waiting for her to open the door, to set it free. Asterisk, we've been waiting for you, asterisk, he said, his face beginning to distort, his eyes narrowing into black pits that seemed to suck the very light from the room. Asterisk, and now, the real game begins, asterisk. Olivia tried to shake her head, tried to deny it, but her strength was fading. The house was feeding on her fear, on her hopelessness. The darkness began to swirl around her, twisting into shapes, forming shadows that reached out with skeletal hands, dragging her toward them. And then the whisper stopped. Everything fell silent. The world was still. But it was not a peaceful stillness. It was the calm before a storm. Asterisk, do you understand now? Asterisk, the figure's voice was softer, almost gentle, but it was laced with an underlying menace. Asterisk, you never had a choice. You were always meant to be here, asterisk. Olivia felt a cold tear slip down her cheek, her mind spinning as the reality of what was happening set in. She wanted to fight, wanted to scream, to claw her way out of this nightmare. But the walls were closing in tighter and tighter, the shadows consuming her, filling every inch of the space around her. And then, in the silence, she heard something else. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, a heartbeat. It wasn't her own. It was coming from the floor beneath her, from deep within the earth itself. The heartbeat was slow, steady, rhythmic, as though the house itself was alive, pulsing with a life of its own. Asterisk, it's not over, Olivia, asterisk. The figure's words were almost a whisper now, as though they were coming from inside her mind. Asterisk, you're just beginning to understand, asterisk. Her vision blurred again and the darkness closed in once more, but this time it was different. This time she didn't resist. She didn't have the strength to. As the shadows swallowed her whole, Olivia realized the terrible truth. There was no escape. The house had her. And it always would. With that final chilling realization, the story came to an end. But what happens now? The house still stands, waiting for its next victim. The darkness never leaves, and the whispers continue in the deep, hidden corners. And perhaps, somewhere in the house there's another door. Another name waiting to be called. Would you like to see what comes next? Or has this journey through the house left you wondering what else lurks in the shadows? The choice is yours.